I'll never forget the moment my father looked me in the eye and said the words that shattered everything I thought family meant. "You're not coming on the yacht. I've given your spot to Maria, our housekeeper. At least she knows her place." The crowd of relatives and neighbors gathered at the dock fell silent. Some looked away in pity. Others smirked, enjoying the show. My golden child sister Lila stood beside him in her designer resort wear arms crossed with that smug expression I'd seen my entire life. "This trip is for successful people, Joanna," my father announced loud enough for everyone to hear. "You don't fit the image of this family. Go home." I stood there in my simple clothes, clutching the small gift I'd brought for him, a compass, because I'd foolishly believed in second chances. The cameras came out. A cousin started filming. This was my public execution, and everyone had front row seats. Lila leaned in close, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "Not everyone is born to belong on luxury trips. Just go home." I smiled, really smiled for the first time in years. "I am going home," I said quietly. That's when I heard it. A voice from the yacht's gangway that would change everything. "Welcome aboard, Madam Owner." The entire marina went silent. My father's face drained of color. Lila's smug expression crumbled into confusion. Because the $3 million yacht he was about to vacation on, the one he'd used to humiliate me in front of everyone, it was mine. What happened next would expose secrets that would destroy my father's reputation, reveal a conspiracy that spanned generations, and prove that the daughter he called worthless was the one who held all the power. This is the story of how I went from family scapegoat to Madam Owner, and trust me, you won't believe what happens next. My name is Joanna Hunter. I'm 37 years old, and for the past 19 years I've built a life my family knows absolutely nothing about. On paper, I run a luxury hospitality company that manages high-end properties and yacht charters for clients who value discretion above all else. In reality, I've spent nearly 2 decades deliberately staying invisible to the people who raised me because being forgotten was safer than being destroyed all over again. But 3 weeks ago, I received an invitation that made me question everything I'd built those walls to protect. My father was organizing what he called a family reconciliation voyage, a week-long luxury yacht trip to celebrate his 65th birthday. The invitation, delivered by my mother's careful handwriting on expensive cardstock, included a personal note. "Please come home, Joanna. It's time to heal old wounds." I wanted to believe her. God help me. I wanted to believe that somewhere in the rubble of my childhood, there was still a foundation worth rebuilding. So I did something I swore I'd never do again. I went home. The drive into my hometown felt like traveling backward through time. Every familiar street corner brought back memories I'd spent years trying to forget: the park where I'd eaten lunch alone because Lila's friends were too cool to include me, the library where I'd hidden during family gatherings, the corner store where the owner used to ask why I was always by myself. Nothing had changed, really. The houses were freshly painted and the cars were newer, but the weight of the place settled on my chest exactly the same way it had when I was 18 and desperate to escape. My father's waterfront mansion sat at the end of Harborview Drive, exactly where old money had always lived in this town. The circular driveway was already crowded with expensive cars by the time I arrived at noon. Mercedes, BMWs, even a Tesla, the usual display of wealth that my father cultivated like a garden. I parked my modest rental sedan near the street, deliberately choosing not to bring my own car. I'd learned long ago that showing up in anything too nice would be seen as putting on airs, while arriving in something too humble would confirm their belief that I'd failed at life. I'd brought a gift, a vintage brass compass I'd found at an antique shop in Portland. It was engraved with the words, "Find your way home," across the back. Looking at it now, sitting in that leather box on my passenger seat, I felt ridiculous. What had I been thinking? That a symbolic trinket would somehow bridge 2 decades of silence and dismissal. That my father would open it, understand the message, and suddenly see me as something other than the daughter who'd disappointed him by being born first. but I'd already driven 6 hours. I'd already let myself hope. So I picked up that box, straightened my simple navy dress, and walked toward the house like I was walking toward the edge of a cliff. The backyard was transformed into something out of a luxury magazine spread. White tents with gauzy curtains, tables with elaborate floral centerpieces, catering staff in crisp uniforms, circulating with champagne flutes. At least 40 people had already arrived. Relatives I hadn't seen in years, neighbors who'd watched me grow up, business associates who'd never bothered to learn my name. The massive yacht was docked at my father's private pier, gleaming white against the blue harbor water, its deck strung with lights that would sparkle once the sun set. I saw my father first. Richard Hunter still commanding at 65, his silver hair perfectly styled, his linen shirt probably worth more than most people's monthly rent. He was holding court near the bar, gesturing with his whiskey glass, while a semicircle of admirers laughed at whatever story he was telling. He'd always been good at stories, at crafting narratives, where he was the hero, the visionary, the man who'd built something from nothing. The parts he left out were always the most interesting. Then I saw Lila, and my stomach dropped the way it always did. My sister was 28 now, 9 years younger than me, and she'd only gotten more polished with time. She wore a flowing white resort dress that probably cost what I used to make in a month at my first job, her honey blonde hair falling in perfect waves past her shoulders. She was laughing with a cluster of cousins, one hand casually resting on the arm of a man I didn't recognize. Probably another in her long line of boyfriends who were acceptable because they came from the right families. I took a breath and walked toward them, the compass box feeling heavier with each step. A few people glanced my way, their expressions flickering through recognition, confusion, and something that might have been pity. I heard the whispers start before I was even halfway across the lawn. "Is that Joanna?" I thought she wasn't coming. Nobody told me she'd be here. My mother appeared from somewhere in the crowd, her face brightening in that desperate way that made my chest ache. Margaret Hunter had always been beautiful in that fragile, uncertain way, like a woman who'd spent her whole life trying to make herself smaller so everyone else could feel bigger. She reached for my hand, squeezing it quickly, and whispered, "I'm so glad you came," before my father's voice cut through the pleasant buzz of conversation like a knife through silk. "Joanna." He didn't say it warmly. He said my name the way you'd identify something unexpected and vaguely unpleasant, like finding a stain on your favorite shirt. I wasn't aware you'd decided to attend. The conversations around us died in ripples. People turned to watch, sensing something more interesting than small talk was about to unfold. I forced myself to smile, to hold up the compass box like an offering. "I received an invitation. I thought—" The invitation was sent prematurely. His voice carried across the suddenly quiet yard. "There's been a change of plans regarding the guest list." I felt the ground shift under my feet, that old, familiar sensation of the world tilting just slightly off its axis. "I don't understand." "The yacht has limited capacity, and we've had to make some difficult decisions about who best represents this family during such an important trip." He set his glass down on a nearby table with a decisive click. "I've given your spot to Maria. She's been with us for 15 years, loyal, hardworking, never asking for more than she's earned. I think that kind of dedication deserves recognition, don't you? Maria, our housekeeper, the kind woman who'd slipped me cookies when I was a child and hidden in the kitchen, who'd never once made me feel like I was in the way. I saw her now, standing near the catering tent, her face stricken with mortification. She mouthed, "I'm sorry," across the distance, but my father was still talking and everyone was still watching, and I realized with horrible clarity that this wasn't about Maria at all. This was about me, about putting me in my place one more time just to make sure I remembered where that place was. "You don't fit the image we're trying to project." My father continued, his voice taking on that lecturing tone I remembered from every childhood disappointment. "This trip isn't just a vacation. We'll be entertaining important business contacts, potential investors. We need people who reflect success sophistication. People who reflect well on you." I heard myself say, and immediately wished I hadn't. Defending myself only ever made things worse. Lila appeared beside father, her arm linking through his in a show of solidarity that made something in my chest crack. She looked at me with that particular expression I'd seen 1,000 times, part pity, part triumph, entirely condescending. "Not everyone is born to belong on luxury trips, Joe." She'd always called me Joe when she wanted to sound affectionate while cutting deep. "Some people are just more naturally suited to certain lifestyles. You understand, don't you?" I understood. I'd always understood. That was the problem. I understood that no matter what I did, how hard I worked, how much I achieved, I would always be the daughter who didn't quite measure up, the one who'd been replaced by the housekeeper because at least Maria knew her place. The cousin with the phone was recording everything, now making no effort to hide it. Other people had their devices out too. This was entertainment, a family drama playing out for an audience that would dissect it over dinner parties for weeks to come. Poor Joanna Hunter showing up where she wasn't wanted, too clueless to realize she'd never really belonged. I looked at the compass in my hands, "Find your way home," and almost laughed. What had I expected? That after 19 years of silence they'd suddenly developed the capacity to see me as anything other than their favorite disappointment. I turned to leave, my face burning, my vision blurring slightly at the edges. I would not cry. Not here. Not in front of them. I'd given them enough satisfaction for one day. That's when my father's voice followed me loud enough for everyone to hear, final as a door slamming shut. "Don't you dare show up at the dock tomorrow. You'll only embarrass yourself even more." I didn't go far. Just to the parking lot where I sat in my rental car for 10 minutes, staring at the compass still clutched in my hand, waiting for the shaking to stop. Then I drove exactly 4 miles down Harbor Boulevard to the building I'd purchased 18 months ago under the name of my holding company. The doorman greeted me with the professional warmth of someone who knew exactly who paid his salary. "Good afternoon, Ms. Hunter. I hope you had a pleasant drive." I managed something that resembled a smile and took the private elevator to the top floor. The penthouse spread across the entire 20th-story floor-to-ceiling windows, offering an unobstructed view of the harbor. I could see my father's mansion from here, a white dot in the distance. I could see his private dock, and beyond it the glittering expanse of water where tomorrow's humiliation was meant to set sail. I'd chosen this location deliberately, though I'd told myself at the time it was just good real estate. Looking at it now, I wondered if some part of me had always known I'd need to watch them from a distance to remind myself why I'd left in the first place. The interior was exactly how I'd designed it, minimalist, clean lines, nothing ostentatious. Neutral grays and warm woods furniture that cost a fortune but didn't scream about it. My desk sat positioned to face those windows, and it was covered with the organized chaos of running a multi-million-dollar business. Contracts waiting for review, financial projections for the next quarter, partnership proposals from hotels in Dubai and Monaco, a leather portfolio containing details on 3 new properties we were considering for acquisition. I poured myself 2 fingers of whiskey from the bar cart, the good stuff aged 30 years, a gift from a client in Scotland, and sat down at my desk. My laptop chimed with a video call request. Marcus Chen, my assistant, and the only person who knew the full truth about where I'd come from. I accepted the call and his face filled the screen, his expression shifting immediately from professional to concerned. "How did it go?" he asked, though clearly my face had already answered. "About as expected." I took a sip of the whiskey, letting it burn away some of the afternoon's humiliation. They made their position clear. I'm not welcome on the family yacht trip because I don't fit their image of success. Marcus made a sound somewhere between sympathy and anger. "The yacht trip. Right. About that Ms. Hunter, you do remember which yacht they've chartered for this event?" I did remember. I'd known the moment I received the invitation and saw the booking details my mother had accidentally included the vessel name, the dates, the broker who'd arranged it. I'd checked our company records just to be absolutely certain, even though I already knew. The Meridian Star, $3 million, purchased by Hunter Maritime Holdings 8 months ago. Your yacht, Marcus said, and there was something almost gleeful in his voice. Your father just publicly humiliated you to avoid taking you on a trip aboard your own yacht. The irony was so perfect it almost made the afternoon worth it. Almost. He doesn't know. He booked through Prestige Charters. They arranged it with our fleet management team. The paperwork all goes through the holding company. My name never appears anywhere he'd see it. This isn't the first time either, Marcus reminded me, pulling up something on his screen. Last year your parents stayed at the Bellevue Resort in Carmel for their anniversary. That's one of ours too. And 3 years ago your sister used our car service for her wedding black Mercedes driver and formal wear, the premium package. She never knew she was paying her estranged sister's company. I'd built all of this deliberately. Hunter Maritime Holdings, Meridian Hospitality Group, Prestige Property Management. A web of subsidiaries and partnerships that never once used my actual last name in any public-facing capacity. I'd learned young that being Richard Hunter's daughter meant one of two things. Either people expected you to fail and waited to watch it happen, or they expected you to succeed only as an extension of him. I'd wanted neither, so I'd become someone else entirely. Someone who signed contracts as J.M. Hunter, whose business reputation was built on discretion and excellence, whose clients included celebrities and CEOs who'd never think to connect her with that other Hunter family from some small coastal town. The whiskey was working warmth spreading through my chest, but it couldn't quite touch the cold knot of memory that Marcus's question had stirred up. I was 18 again, standing in my father's study with a business proposal I'd spent months researching. I wanted $10,000 to start a hospitality consulting service. I'd found a gap in the market's small boutique hotels that needed help with management and guest services, but couldn't afford full-time staff. I'd done the math, created projections, prepared everything the way I'd seen him prepare his own business presentations. He'd laughed. Actually laughed like I'd told him a particularly amusing joke. Joanna, sweetheart, women don't have business minds. You'd spend it on shoes and feelings within a month. Lila had been there, barely 16, giggling behind her hand. My mother had looked away, said nothing, done nothing. Why don't you focus on finding a nice husband? Let him worry about making money. I'd left that night with $200 saved from part-time jobs, a backpack of clothes, and something broken inside my chest that never quite healed right. But I'd also left with a promise I made to myself in the darkness of a bus station at 3 a.m. If I ever succeeded, it would be mine. They'd never get to take credit, never get to control it, never get to use me as a reflection of their success or a target for their cruelty. 19 years later, I'd kept that promise. My company had grown 40% year over year for the last 5 years. We managed properties in 8 countries. Our client list was confidential and exclusive. And tomorrow my father and his carefully curated guest list would board a yacht they had no idea belonged to the daughter he'd just replaced with the housekeeper. Marcus cleared his throat delicately. So, given the circumstances, will you be joining the yacht trip in person tomorrow? You could just let them have their vacation and never tell them. Maintain your privacy. I looked at my reflection in the darkening window, a woman my family didn't really know, had never bothered to know. Behind me, the lights of the city were beginning to glow. In the distance, I could see the Meridian Star's lights twinkling at my father's dock. I smiled at my reflection, and it wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who'd spent 19 years building something that couldn't be taken away, couldn't be diminished, couldn't be replaced by a housekeeper because it was never about being good enough for them in the first place. Yes, I said quietly, but they won't see me coming. I didn't sleep much that night. Instead, I stood at those floor-to-ceiling windows watching the Meridian Star's lights reflect off the dark water, reviewing in my mind exactly how the next morning would unfold. I'd made my decision. There would be no backing down now, no second-guessing. At 6 a.m., I showered, dried my hair into a simple low bun, and dressed in clothing I'd chosen very deliberately, a tailored cream linen pantsuit with a silk navy blouse, modest gold jewelry, flat leather sandals. Nothing flashy, nothing that screamed money, but everything that whispered quiet confidence if you knew how to look. The marina was already buzzing with activity when I arrived at 9:30. Crew members moved efficiently across the Meridian Star's deck, preparing for departure. Catering trucks were unloading supplies. A small crowd had gathered on the dock, my father's guests, dressed in their vacation finest champagne flutes, already in hand despite the early hour. I could see several people I recognized from yesterday, along with some new faces. Business associates, probably. The important contacts Lila had mentioned. I parked in the public lot and walked toward the private dock, my heart beating steadily in my chest. Not with fear exactly. More like the calm focus of someone about to jump off a very high cliff, knowing exactly what waited at the bottom. My father saw me before I was even halfway down the pier. I watched his expression shift from surprise to confusion to something darker, a kind of outraged disbelief that someone he'd dismissed so thoroughly would dare to appear again. He set down his mimosa with enough force that I heard the glass crack from 30 feet away. Then he was moving toward me, his face reddening with each step, and the conversations around him began to falter and die as people turned to see what had caught his attention. "What the hell are you doing here?" His voice carried across the water, bouncing off the boats, ensuring that every single person present could hear him perfectly. "I made myself very clear yesterday, Joanna. You are not welcome on this trip." I stopped walking, standing perfectly still on the sun-warmed boards of the dock. "I received an invitation. I thought—" "You thought wrong." He closed the distance between us, standing so close I could smell the champagne on his breath, could see the small burst blood vessels in his nose that spoke of too many years of expensive drinking. "This is embarrassing. For you, for me, for everyone here. You're making a spectacle of yourself, following us around like some kind of desperate hanger-on." The words were designed to wound, and they did, each one landing like a physical blow. But I'd spent 19 years learning how to stand still while being cut to pieces. I kept my face neutral, my breathing steady. I would not give him the satisfaction of seeing me break. "Do you understand how pathetic this looks?" He gestured broadly to the crowd, making sure they were all witnesses to my humiliation. "Showing up uninvited, begging for scraps of a lifestyle you could never afford on your own. This yacht costs more than you'll make in a lifetime. These people—" He waved toward his guests. "They've actually accomplished something with their lives. What have you done? Disappeared for nearly 20 years and accomplished exactly nothing." That's when Lila appeared, as if summoned by the sound of my public dismantling. She glided across the dock in a white sundress that probably cost $3,000, her arm immediately linking through Father's in a show of united front. Her eyes found mine, and there was something in them that looked almost like satisfaction. Like this was the natural order of things being restored. "Joe, this is just sad." Her voice was honey-sweet, the tone you'd use with a confused child. "Yesterday wasn't clear enough. You really thought you could just show up today and everything would be fine." She turned slightly, addressing the watching crowd as much as me. "This trip isn't a vacation. Father has important business negotiations happening. We'll have investors on board, potential partners for his new development project. We can't have—" she paused delicately, "family drama interfering with serious business." "What your sister means," Father interjected, his voice getting louder, more aggressive, "is that you'd be an embarrassment. Look at you. Simple clothes, no sense of occasion, completely out of place among people who actually matter. Did you think we'd see you standing here and suddenly change our minds? Welcome you aboard with open arms." I saw my cousin Tyler in the crowd, his phone held high, capturing everything. Others had their devices out too now. This was entertainment, the black sheep of the Hunter family being put in her place one more time, and everyone wanted a front row seat. I recognized several of my father's business associates, their expressions ranging from uncomfortable to amused. A few neighbors who'd watched me grow up, who were probably already composing the story they'd tell at their next bridge club meeting. "You've always been like this," Father continued, and now he was pointing at me, his finger jabbing the air between us. "Selfish, ungrateful. You left this family 20 years ago because you thought you were too good for us, and now you want back in. Now you want to enjoy the fruits of my success." His voice rose another notch. "You're a failure, Joanna. A burden. And I will not have you ruining this trip for people who actually deserve to be here." My hands were shaking. I noticed it distantly, the way you notice rain starting to fall when you're thinking about something else. I curled my fingers into my palms, keeping my arms loose at my sides, refusing to cross them defensively or hug myself protectively. The crowd's discomfort was growing. I could feel it in the shifting feet, the cleared throats, the way some people were looking away now. This had crossed some invisible line from family disagreement into something uglier, something that felt like public abuse. A marina worker had stopped coiling rope on a nearby boat, watching with obvious concern. Another crew member stood frozen at the top of the Meridian Star's gangway, clearly unsure whether to intervene. Even some of my father's guests looked uncomfortable now, though none of them said anything. None of them ever did. "I think you should leave now," Lila said, her voice still sweet, still kind, which somehow made it worse. "Before this gets more embarrassing than it already is. For everyone's sake, Joe, just go home." I took a breath, deep and slow, filling my lungs with salt air and morning sun and the smell of expensive perfume mixed with diesel fuel. I was about to turn away, about to walk back down that dock with whatever dignity I had left, when I heard it. A voice from the yacht's gangway, clear and carrying and absolutely unmistakable. "Welcome aboard, Madam Owner." The entire dock fell silent. Every head on that dock turned toward the Meridian Star. Captain Daniel Pierce stood at the top of the gangway in his crisp white uniform, his weathered face creased in what might have been a smile. He descended the steps with the unhurried confidence of a man who'd spent 40 years on the water and had no patience for games. When he reached the dock, he walked straight past my father, past Lila, past the entire gathered crowd, and stopped directly in front of me. "Ms. Hunter," he said, extending his hand with genuine warmth. "Welcome aboard. Your vessel is ready for inspection, and the crew is prepared to proceed with the charter as scheduled." The silence that followed was absolute. I could hear the water lapping against the hull, the distant cry of a seagull, the faint hum of the yacht's generators. What I couldn't hear was a single human voice, because every single person on that dock had stopped breathing. My father found his voice first, though it came out strangled, confused. "There must be some mistake. Captain Pierce, I'm the one who chartered this yacht. I paid. You are indeed a valued charter client, Mr. Hunter." The captain interrupted his tone, remaining perfectly professional but allowing no room for argument. "Your booking was arranged through Prestige Charters confirmed 6 weeks ago, deposit paid in full. However, the Meridian Star is owned by Hunter Maritime Holdings." He turned slightly, gesturing toward me. "Ms. Joanna Hunter is the principal owner of that company, and by extension, this vessel." I watched my father's face cycle through emotions too quickly to name confusion, giving way to disbelief. Disbelief, to something that looked almost like fear. Lila had gone pale, her hand slipping from father's arm as she stared at me like I'd suddenly transformed into a completely different person. Which I supposed I had. Or rather, I'd always been this person. They'd just never bothered to look. "That's impossible," Father said, but his voice had lost its certainty. She doesn't have this yacht is worth millions." $3 million, to be precise," I said quietly. It was the first time I'd spoken since the captain's announcement, and my voice carried clearly in the shocked silence. "Purchased 8 months ago, fully insured and registered, maintained by a crew of 12 currently booked at 70% capacity for the season." A young crew member appeared beside Captain Pierce holding a tablet that she offered to my father with professional courtesy. "Sir, if you'd like to review the charter agreement, you'll find all the relevant information here. The booking confirmation, the transfer of deposit, and the certificate of ownership showing Hunter Maritime Holdings as the registered owner. Ms. Hunter's name appears on the corporate registration documents." My father took the tablet with shaking hands. I watched him scroll through page after page of official documentation and corporation papers, Coast Guard registration, insurance certificates. The charter contract he'd signed himself 6 weeks ago without ever noticing the fine print about the vessel's ownership structure. Every document was perfectly legitimate, professionally prepared, legally sound. There was no mistake, no confusion, no way to explain this away. That's when I saw movement from the edge of the crowd. A man in an expensive suit, perhaps 50 years old, with the kind of careful grooming that suggested serious money. He stepped forward, and I recognized him from the business section of the local paper. James Collins, a real estate developer father had been courting for months, trying to bring him in as an investor on some waterfront project. Collins looked from my father to me, his expression shifting from curiosity to something sharper, more calculating. "Ms. Hunter," he said, his voice cutting through the murmurs that had started rippling through the crowd. "Hunter Maritime Holdings, that's part of the Meridian Hospitality Group, isn't it? I've heard quite a bit about your company's reputation. Very selective clientele, exceptional service standards. I didn't realize you were local." "I prefer to keep my business and personal lives separate," I said, meeting his eyes steadily. "But yes, Meridian Hospitality is my primary enterprise. We manage properties and vessels across 8 countries. The crowd was no longer silent. Whispers had erupted, people pulling out phones not to record my humiliation, but to search for information about my company, about me, about how spectacularly they'd all misunderstood the situation they were witnessing. I saw shock on faces that moments ago had watched my father berate me with casual indifference. I saw Tyler lower his phone slowly, his expression shifting from entertainment to something like awe. I saw my mother standing behind the crowd, her hand pressed to her mouth, tears streaming down her face, and I saw Maria, our housekeeper, the woman whose presence had been used to replace mine, standing near the catering supplies with tears rolling down her cheeks. But she was smiling, actually smiling, and when our eyes met, she nodded once, a small gesture of acknowledgement, of vindication for every kindness she'd shown the awkward child who used to hide in the kitchen. The power dynamic on that dock shifted so visibly I could almost feel the air pressure change. People who'd watched my humiliation with distant amusement were now looking at me with new eyes, recalculating, reassessing. A woman they'd dismissed as a failure was actually someone who owned the very symbol of luxury my father had used to exclude her. Someone who'd built an empire they'd never even known existed. I turned to Captain Pierce, keeping my voice steady, professional. "I came to personally oversee the charter and ensure our standards are maintained. I trust there are no issues with the vessel or crew preparations." "None whatsoever, Ms. Hunter. We're ready to depart on schedule." "Excellent." I glanced at my father, who was still holding that tablet like it might explode in his hands. "The charter will proceed as planned. I simply wanted to be aboard to monitor operations." I paused, letting the weight of my next words settle. After all, when we have such distinguished guests, it's important that the owner ensures everything meets expectations. That single word, guests, landed like a stone in still water. Because that's what they were now. Not hosts, not the ones in control, not the arbiters of who belonged and who didn't. They were guests on my yacht, recipients of my hospitality, subject to my decisions about how this trip would unfold. I walked past my father, past Lila's stricken face, past the crowd that parted automatically to let me through. I climbed the gangway with steady steps, feeling the solid teak beneath my feet, breathing in the familiar smell of salt and varnish and expensive upholstery. This was mine. I'd earned it, built it, created it from nothing but determination and a promise I'd made to myself at 18 years old in a dark bus station. At the top of the gangway, I paused and looked back. My father stood frozen on the dock, his face an unreadable mask. Our eyes met, and I spoke quietly, just loud enough for him to hear over the distance. "If you come aboard, remember this time you're a guest on my ship." They came aboard in silence, a procession of stunned faces and expensive luggage, the festive energy from the dock completely evaporated. My father moved like a man in a dream, or perhaps a nightmare. His usual commanding presence diminished into something smaller, uncertain. Lila followed close behind him, her designer sunglasses hiding her eyes, but I could see the tight line of her mouth the way her knuckles whitened around the handle of her carry-on. The other guests filtered up the gangway with the cautious energy of people who'd witnessed something they didn't fully understand and weren't sure how to proceed. I stood on the main deck with Captain Pierce discussing the route modifications I'd reviewed last night. The original itinerary my father had requested was heavy on show, pulling into crowded marinas, where people could see the yacht hosting loud evening parties on deck, maximizing visibility. I adjusted it. We'd anchor in quieter coves, focus on smaller group dining, create spaces for actual conversation instead of performance. The captain nodded approvingly as I spoke, occasionally offering suggestions based on his knowledge of the coastline, treating me with the easy respect of someone who knew exactly whose name appeared on his paychecks. Every crew member I passed offered a polite nod, a "Good morning, Ms. Hunter," a deference that wasn't performative but genuine. They knew who I was, had known for the 8 months since I'd purchased the vessel, and they operated with the kind of smooth professionalism that comes from working for someone who respects their expertise. I'd made a point of learning each of their names, understanding their roles, ensuring they were paid above industry standard. They weren't props in my father's theater of wealth. They were skilled professionals doing difficult work. Maria found me near the starboard rail, her hands twisting together nervously. She started to speak to apologize, but I stopped her with a gentle touch on her arm. "Maria, you did nothing wrong. You were used as a prop to hurt me. That's not your fault, and I don't want you to carry that guilt." Her eyes filled with tears. "I didn't know, mija. I swear I didn't know about any of this. When Mr. Hunter told me I'd be coming instead of you. I thought maybe it was a mistake, but he said what he needed to say to make me feel small." I finished quietly. "That's what he does. But you've been kind to me since I was a child, hiding in the kitchen, sneaking cookies, and pretending I belonged somewhere. Please enjoy this trip. You've earned it more than most people aboard." The master suite assignment came up within the first hour. Captain Pierce informed my father with perfect professional courtesy that per Ms. Hunter's instructions, the owner's suite would be reserved for my use during this voyage. It was traditionally reserved for the family head, yes, but as the vessel's owner, that designation naturally fell to me. My father could certainly have the starboard VIP cabin, which was quite spacious and comfortable, appointed with every luxury. I watched my father's jaw tighten, watched him start to object, then realize he had no ground to stand on. What could he say? That he deserved the best cabin on a yacht he didn't own? That his daughter, whom he'd publicly humiliated for not fitting his image of success, should defer to him in her own property? He took the VIP cabin without another word, and I felt something shift in the air, a fundamental reordering of hierarchy that everyone aboard could sense. The rest of the day unfolded in small moments of adjustment. My father tried to select wines for dinner, and the steward politely checked with me first. "Ms. Hunter, would you approve this selection for this evening's meal?" He attempted to dictate the departure time for the next morning, and Captain Pierce deferred to my previously stated preference. "Mr. Hunter, Ms. Hunter has requested we depart at 9 to allow for morning swim time. If you'd like to request a change, I can certainly ask her." Every small authority he'd assumed would be his was quietly redirected to me, not through any overt power play on my part, but simply because that's how operations worked. This was my vessel, my crew, my decisions. Other guests began unconsciously adjusting their behavior too. Cousins who'd ignored me at the dock now offered careful smiles. Business associates struck up conversations, asked questions about my company with new interest. James Collins made a point of sitting beside me at lunch, asking thoughtful questions about the hospitality industry, international property management, the challenges of maintaining service standards across multiple countries. The sun was setting over the water, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose when I decided to take a walk around the deck. The yacht was anchored in a quiet cove, just as I'd requested, the only sounds the gentle lap of waves against the hull and the distant cry of seabirds. Most guests had retreated to their cabins to rest before dinner. I found myself near the main salon, its windows open to catch the evening breeze. That's when I heard my father's voice, low and urgent, coming from inside. I stopped, not intending to eavesdrop, but unable to move once I recognized the tone, the one he used for business discussions he didn't want overheard. Lila's voice responded, equally quiet. "We have to move faster than we planned," Father was saying. "This changes everything. If Joanna's actually successful, actually has resources, she might start asking questions." "Questions about what?" Lila asked. "The land, grandmother's property. We need to sell it before she finds out about the situation." There was a pause, the sound of ice clinking in a glass. "The debt is worse than I told you. Much worse. The buyers are ready to close, but if there are complications with the title, if someone contests the sale..." My grandmother's land. The small property in the hills where her cottage had stood, where I'd spent summer weeks as a child, learning to garden, to bake, to exist without apologizing for taking up space. She'd died 4 years ago, and I'd been too heartbroken to attend the funeral, sending flowers from across the country with a card I'd agonized over for days. I hadn't known what had happened to her property. I'd assumed my father had inherited it, along with everything else she'd owned. "Joanna was always her favorite," Lila said, and there was something bitter in her voice. "What if grandmother left her something? What if there's a will we don't know about?" "There isn't. I made sure of that. The land is mine, legally, mine, and it'll be sold by the end of the month." Father's voice dropped even lower. "But we can't let Joanna start digging into family finances. Not now. Not when we're this close." I stood frozen in the shadows of the deck, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. This wasn't just about ego or image or the petty cruelties of a dysfunctional family. This was about money, about assets, about something my father was desperate to hide. And it involved the one place on earth where I'd felt unconditionally loved, the one connection to someone who'd seen me as worthy without requiring me to prove it first. I moved away from the salon as quietly as I'd approached, walking to the bow of the yacht where the signal was strongest. My hands shook slightly as I pulled out my phone and opened my secure messaging app, the one I used for sensitive business communications. I typed carefully, knowing exactly what I needed. "James, I need every document related to my grandmother's property and her will. Complete title history, any transfers, any debts or liens. Also pull my father's financial records if you can access them legally. Something's wrong and I need to know what they're hiding." I hit send and watched the message disappear into encrypted channels, heading toward my lawyer in his Seattle office, where he'd see it first thing in the morning. The sun had set completely now, stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. Behind me, I could hear the crew preparing dinner, the murmur of guests gathering, the yacht settling into its evening routine. But I couldn't shake the cold certainty settling in my chest. The humiliation at the dock, the years of dismissal and cruelty, all of that I'd survived, processed, built my life around. This was different. This was about erasing the memory of the one person who'd loved me without conditions, about stealing the last piece of ground where I'd felt I belonged. And I wasn't going to let it happen. I couldn't sleep. The yacht's gentle rocking usually soothed me on the rare occasions I stayed aboard my vessels. But tonight, every creak of the hull, every distant sound felt amplified by the questions churning through my mind. At 2 a.m, I gave up trying, pulled on a sweater over my pajamas, and ventured out onto the deck. The night air was cool, the water black and smooth as glass, stars scattered across the sky in patterns I'd learned to navigate by as a child at my grandmother's cottage. I wasn't the only one awake. Light spilled from the main lounge windows, and as I moved closer, I heard voices again, my father and Lila still talking, or perhaps talking again. I positioned myself in the shadows near the exterior stairs where I could hear clearly, but remain unseen. "Collins is perfect," Father was saying. "He's got the capital, he's motivated, and most importantly, he doesn't know the area well enough to ask difficult questions. We list it as undeveloped land with potential. He sees an opportunity, we close fast." "But what about the actual value?" Lila asked. If it's worth more than we're selling for. It doesn't matter what it's worth if we're drowning in debt, Father snapped. The investment losses from that tech startup alone are catastrophic. Then there's the loan I took against the house, the business credit lines that are maxed out. If I don't generate cash immediately, we lose everything. The land is a dead asset sitting there doing nothing. Better to sell it now, cover the debts, and move forward. Dead asset. That's what he called the place where my grandmother had planted roses and taught me their names. Where she'd let me help her bake bread, my small hands covered in flour, praised for trying even when my loaves came out lopsided. Where she'd read to me for hours on the porch swing, never once suggesting I should be prettier or quieter or more like Lila. What if Joanna asks about it? Lila's voice was quieter now, uncertain. She loved that place, and now that we know she's actually successful, has resources. Joanna contributed nothing to this family. Father interrupted, and the words were so familiar I could have recited them myself. She left at 18, didn't come back for the funeral, didn't help with estate settlement, didn't participate in any family obligations. She has no right to interfere in decisions about family assets. The land is in my name. The paperwork is clear. She has no legal standing to contest anything. I pressed my palm against the cool metal railing, steadying myself against the wave of memories. Summers at grandmother's cottage weren't just happy, they were the only times in my childhood I could breathe without feeling like I was doing it wrong. Grandmother had never compared me to Lila, never suggested I should be different than I was. When I brought her my school papers, she'd pin them to her refrigerator regardless of the grades. When I told her my dreams, however small or strange, she'd listen like I was sharing the secrets of the universe. You're perfect exactly as you are, she used to tell me, brushing my hair on the porch while the sun set over the hills. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise, not even family. Especially not family. I'd thought in my child's understanding that she meant I should ignore the cruel comments, the constant corrections, the way I was always somehow falling short of expectations. Now standing in the darkness, listening to my father plot to sell the last physical reminder of her love, I wondered if she'd known something I hadn't, if she'd seen what kind of man her son had become and tried to warn me. We need to move before the end of the month, Father continued. Collins is leaving for Europe in 3 weeks. If we can close before then, the money will clear, debts get paid, and by the time anyone asks questions, it's done. I retreated silently, my bare feet making no sound on the teak deck. Back in the master suite, I opened my laptop and pulled up the county property records, something I should have done years ago, but couldn't bear to face after grandmother's death. The listing was simple. A 3-acre parcel, undeveloped land, with an old cottage marked as structure removed. Removed. They'd torn down her house. The porch swing where she'd read to me, the kitchen where we'd baked together, the bedroom with the window that looked out over her rose garden, all of it gone, reduced to structure removed in a database. The owner of record was Richard Hunter, transferred from Eleanor Mason's estate 4 years ago upon her death. Everything looked official, legal, exactly as my father had claimed. But something felt wrong. Grandmother had been meticulous about paperwork, about making sure things were documented properly. She'd worked as a legal secretary for 30 years before retiring. She would have known how to protect things she cared about. I thought about her final months, the phone calls where her voice had grown weaker but her mind stayed sharp. She'd said something I hadn't understood at the time, something about making sure things are protected for the right people. I'd thought she was confused medication making her ramble. But grandmother never rambled. Every word was deliberate. I pulled out my phone, not caring that it was 2:30 in the morning, and sent another message to James. This one was longer, more detailed. I needed everything, not just the will on record, but any amendments, any codicils, any documents filed in the months before her death. I needed the complete chain of title going back to when she first purchased the property. I needed to know if there were any liens, any debts, any legal encumbrances that might explain my father's urgency. And I needed it all done discreetly, no direct contact with my father or anyone in his circle. The message sent disappearing into the encrypted system, and I sat back against the headboard pulling my grandmother's quilt, the one thing I'd taken from her house before I left at 18, tighter around my shoulders. It smelled faintly of lavender, still even after all these years. She used to tuck sachets of it in her linen closet between the sheets she'd wash, and hang on the line to dry in the sun. "You're stronger than you know," she'd told me the last time I saw her when I'd driven 8 hours to visit her in the hospital, arrived late at night when no one else was there. "When the time comes, you'll know what to do. I've made sure of it." I'd kissed her forehead, promised to visit again soon, and then she'd died 3 days later while I was on a plane heading to a business meeting I couldn't reschedule. I'd never forgiven myself for not being there at the end, for prioritizing work over the one person who'd loved me unconditionally. But maybe she'd forgiven me. Maybe she'd even planned for it, knowing I'd be too busy building the life she'd encouraged me to build, the one where I didn't need anyone's permission to exist. Maybe making sure things are protected hadn't been confused rambling at all. The sky was beginning to lighten that deep blue-black, giving way to the first hints of dawn when my phone buzzed with an incoming call. James Chen calling at 5:45 in the morning Pacific time, which meant it was 8:45 in Seattle and he was already at his office. I answered on the first ring. "James?" "Ms. Hunter." His voice was tight, controlled, the way it got when he'd discovered something significant. "You need to see this immediately. I've been reviewing the probate records and your grandmother's will. There are 2 versions, 2 completely separate documents. And the second one changes everything." I switched the call to video, needing to see James's face to read the expression that would tell me just how serious this was. He appeared on my screen, his usually immaculate appearance, slightly disheveled tie, loosened shirt sleeves rolled up. He'd been working through the night. "Walk me through it," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. James pulled up documents on his screen, sharing them so I could see. "Will number 1 was filed with the probate court 4 years ago, shortly after your grandmother's death. Standard distribution, her savings account about $40,000 split equally between your father and your mother. Personal effects divided among family. Your father named as executor. The land wasn't specifically mentioned, so under state law it would have passed to your father as her sole child." "That's the will I knew about," I said. "Or thought I knew about." "Right. But 6 months before she died, your grandmother executed a second will at a different law office, Morrison and Associates, about 30 miles from her town. This will specifically addresses the land and only the land. Everything else remains as stated in will number 1. He pulled up the document, and I leaned closer to read my grandmother's words on the screen. "To my granddaughter, Joanna Marie Hunter, I leave the property located at 487 Hillside Road, comprising 3 acres and all structures thereon. This bequest is made with the understanding that some legacies cannot be measured in money, and that the true value of this land lies in the peace it has provided and the memories it holds. I trust Joanna to honor this legacy as she sees fit." My throat tightened, reading words my grandmother had written specifically for me, ensuring I'd have this one piece of her love made permanent and legal. Why didn't anyone know about this? Why wasn't it filed with the probate court? Because it was filed separately at a different courthouse in accordance with state law that allows for property-specific codicils to be recorded where the property is located, rather than where the decedent lived. James pulled up another document. It's properly notarized, witnessed by 2 people who weren't beneficiaries, and it explicitly states that it supersedes any previous bequests regarding this specific property. Legally, this land has been yours for 4 years. I sat back processing this. My father doesn't know. I don't think he does. The second will was never mentioned in the main probate proceedings, and unless someone specifically searched property records in that county, there'd be no reason to discover it. James paused, his expression darkening. "But that's not the worst of it. 2 years ago, your father took out a substantial loan using that land as collateral." He pulled up bank documents, and I felt my stomach drop as I read through them. A loan for $1.5 million from Coastal Regional Bank with the Hillside Road property listed as security. The documentation included property deeds, title insurance, and my breath caught a power of attorney document bearing my signature authorizing my father to mortgage the property on my behalf. "I never signed this," I said immediately. "I've never signed anything related to that property. I didn't even know I owned it." "I know. I had it analyzed by a forensic document examiner last night, called in a favor for the rush job." James pulled up the expert's report. "The signature is a forgery. A fairly skilled one, probably traced from another document, but the pressure points are wrong, the pen angle is inconsistent. And there are hesitation marks where someone was trying to copy your writing style. It's definitely not your signature." The implications crashed over me like a wave. That's fraud. That's criminal fraud. Forgery fraud, potentially identity theft. If we report this to authorities, your father is looking at 5 to 10 years in prison, possibly more given the amount involved. James's expression was grim. "But there's a complication. If we go that route immediately, the bank will discover the fraud and move to foreclose on the property to recover their money. You'd be tied up in litigation for years, possibly losing the land in the process while everything gets sorted out." I stood up, pacing the small space of the master suite, my mind racing through scenarios and consequences. What are my other options? We confront him privately, present the evidence, and demand he repay the loan from his personal assets in exchange for not pressing criminal charges. It's faster, cleaner, and you keep control of the property. James leaned forward. Or, and this is the approach I'd recommend, you confront him publicly in front of witnesses who matter. Give him the opportunity to do the right thing voluntarily. If he refuses or tries to manipulate the situation, then you have multiple witnesses to his response, and we proceed with criminal charges from a stronger position. I thought about Collins, the investor my father was trying to court. About the other business associates aboard, people whose opinion my father valued more than his own daughter's well-being. About Lila, who'd stood beside him while he humiliated me, who'd participated in the cruelty without ever asking if it was justified. About my mother, who'd watched it all happen for decades and said nothing. "I want to confront him publicly," I said finally. "Tomorrow morning before we reach the marina. I want everyone who witnessed what happened at the dock to see this. I want Collins to know exactly who he was considering doing business with." "That's risky," James warned. "He could become aggressive, could try to turn it around on you, could do what, humiliate me more than he already has." I shook my head. "No. I'm done hiding. I'm done protecting him from the consequences of his choices. If he wants to avoid prison, he can start by telling the truth in front of the people whose respect he values so much." James was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I'll prepare all the documentation, have everything ready to present. I can be on video call during the confrontation if you want legal support in real time." "Yes, do that." I checked the time, almost 6 in the morning now, the sun starting to paint the horizon in shades of pink and gold. "Send me everything. I want to review it all before I face him." "Already sending." James started typing, then paused, looking back at the camera. "There's one more thing. The witness list for will number 2, the people who were present when your grandmother signed it. One of them is someone currently aboard your yacht." I felt my pulse quicken. "Who?" "Raymond Chen. He's listed as a family friend, witnessed the signing at the law office. According to my research, he was your grandmother's financial advisor for over 20 years. James pulled up a photo and I recognized him immediately. The older Asian man I'd seen among the guests, quiet and observant. Someone I'd assumed was one of my father's business contacts. "He's currently listed as a passenger on your charter. Booked his cabin separately, paid his own way. I think it's time you had a conversation with him." The documents started arriving in my secure inbox, one after another. Wills, property records, loan documents, forensic analysis, legal opinions on criminal liability, and civil remedies. Everything I needed to prove that my father had spent the last 4 years illegally controlling property that belonged to me, had forged my signature to borrow against it, and was now trying to sell it out from under me to cover debts I knew nothing about. I opened each file methodically, reading through page after page of evidence, feeling the weight of it settle into my bones. This wasn't just about family dysfunction anymore, about petty cruelties and golden child dynamics. This was about theft, about fraud, about a man so desperate to maintain his image of success that he'd committed crimes against his own daughter. My grandmother had known. Somehow she'd known exactly what kind of man her son had become, and she'd protected me the only way she could, through careful legal planning, through documents that would surface when they were needed most. And she'd made sure someone she trusted would be there to verify the truth, to stand as witness when the time came. I pulled up the passenger manifest for the yacht, found Raymond Chen's contact information, and composed a message requesting a private meeting at 7:30, before the other guests were awake. Then I sat back wrapped in my grandmother's quilt, watching the sun rise over the water, and waited for the day when everything would change. Raymond Chen arrived at 7:30 precisely, knocking softly on the master suite door. He was 72 years old, I learned, with kind eyes that held decades of careful observation. We talked for an hour about my grandmother, about her fierce independence and meticulous planning, about how she'd known her son would try to take everything that mattered. Raymond had helped her structure the second will had witnessed. Her signature had kept silent all these years because she'd asked him to. "She said you'd find out when the time was right," he told me. "She said you were stronger than you knew, and that strength would lead you here eventually." When I asked why he'd come on this trip, he smiled sadly. "Because I knew your father would try something eventually. And because your grandmother asked me to be there when you needed proof that someone had believed in you all along." By 9 o'clock, I'd requested the meeting. Captain Pierce delivered the message personally to each guest. "Ms. Hunter requires your presence in the main lounge at 10 a.m. for a matter concerning family estate business. Attendance is not optional for immediate family members and certain invited guests." My father tried to refuse, tried to assert that he had plans for the morning, but the captain was immovable. "Sir, Ms. Hunter owns this vessel. When she requests a meeting, it's not a suggestion." They assembled exactly at 10. The main lounge was elegant in the morning light, floor-to-ceiling windows, offering views of the calm water, upholstered furniture arranged in a semicircle. I'd had the crew set up a presentation screen and a small table where I'd organized my documents in neat folders, each labeled with names. My laptop was connected to James's video feed, his face visible on a secondary screen there to provide legal expertise in real time. My father arrived last, his expression thunderous, clearly viewing this as some kind of power play he needed to shut down immediately. "Joanna, I don't know what you think you're accomplishing." "Please sit down, Father." My voice was calm, professional, the tone I used in business negotiations. "This won't take long, but it concerns grandmother's estate and certain legal irregularities that affect everyone in this room." He sat, but his body language screamed resistance, arms crossed, jaw tight, eyes challenging. Beside him, Lila looked nervous, uncertain. My mother had taken a seat near the window, her hands folded in her lap, face pale. Colin sat with the attentive interest of someone sensing a business deal gone wrong. And Raymond Chen sat quietly in the corner, his presence somehow both unassuming and significant, watching with that sad acknowledgement of someone who'd known this day would come. 4 years ago, when grandmother died, we all attended the reading of her will. I held up the first folder. This will, which Father shared with us, divided her savings and personal items among family. It was straightforward, uncontested. I set it down and picked up the second folder. What most of us didn't know was that 6 months before her death, grandmother executed a second will at Morrison & Associates law firm, specifically addressing her property on Hillside Road. I opened the folder displaying the document on the screen behind me and read aloud the words my grandmother had written for me. "To my granddaughter, Joanna Marie Hunter, I leave the property located at 487 Hillside Road, comprising 3 acres and all structures thereon. This bequest is made with the understanding that some legacies cannot be measured in money, and that the true value of this land lies in the peace it has provided and the memories it holds." My voice caught slightly on that last phrase, but I pushed through. "This document is properly notarized, legally executed, and filed with the property records in accordance with state law." My father's face had gone from red to pale. "That's impossible." I would have known about a second will. Not if it was filed separately in a different jurisdiction, as property-specific codicils are allowed to be under state law. I looked at Raymond. Mr. Chen, you were present at the signing. Can you confirm this document's authenticity? Raymond stood, his voice steady and clear. I witnessed Eleanor Mason sign that will on March 15th, 4 years ago. She was of sound mind and clear in her intentions. She told me, my son will try to take everything that matters to Joanna. This is the one thing I can protect. I have kept a copy in my files since that day as she requested. Collins leaned forward, his business acumen engaged. If that will was properly executed later than the first will, it would supersede any previous arrangements regarding that specific property. That's standard probate law. Exactly. I looked directly at my father. Which means the land has been mine for 4 years. You've had no legal right to control it, sell it, or make any decisions regarding it whatsoever. The room had gone absolutely silent. Lila was staring at father with a dawning expression of confusion. My mother had her hand pressed to her mouth. Collins was watching with the sharp attention of someone recalculating everything he thought he knew. But that's not all. I opened another folder and my hands weren't shaking anymore. I was past fear, past hurt, running on pure clarity now. 2 years ago, a loan was taken out for $1.5 million using the Hillside Road property as collateral. The loan application included this document. I displayed it on the screen, the power of attorney bearing my forged signature. I never signed this. I never authorized any loan. I didn't even know I owned the property. I pulled up the forensic analysis. A document examiner has confirmed that this signature is a forgery. The person who created it is guilty of fraud, forgery, and potentially identity theft. We're looking at 5 to 10 years in federal prison. The silence was absolute, now heavy with shock and the weight of criminal implications. My father had gone completely white, his mouth opening and closing without sound. Lila looked like she might be sick. I turned to my sister, and my voice gentled slightly. Lila, you signed this document as a witness. I need to know, did you know the signature was forged? No. The word burst out of her, panicked and raw. No, I thought father said you'd sent authorization by email that you'd agreed to help with a business loan, that it was all arranged. He just needed witnesses for the bank's paperwork. I didn't know, I would never. Tears were streaming down her face now, her hands shaking. I trusted him. I thought it was legitimate. I saw it then, the realization breaking across her face like dawn. Our father hadn't just used me. He'd used both of us, just in different ways. He'd made me the scapegoat, and her the golden child, but we'd both been tools in his hands, manipulated to serve his needs. The only difference was which kind of abuse we'd endured. Oh my God, Lila whispered, looking at father with something like horror. You lied to me. You made me part of a crime. You used me to steal from my own sister. Before father could respond, before he could start the justifications or manipulations or rage that I could see building in his expression, my mother stood up. The chair scraped against the floor loud in the charged silence. Her whole body was trembling, but her voice when she spoke was clear and carrying. I need to say something, she said, looking not at father but at me. I've been silent for 40 years, but not anymore. Every eye in the room turned to my mother. Margaret Hunter, who I'd watched fade into wallpaper for most of my childhood, who'd perfected the art of looking away at crucial moments, who'd chosen silence so consistently, I'd stopped expecting anything else from her. She stood there in her careful beige cardigan and pearl earrings, looking more fragile than I'd ever seen her, but somehow also more solid, like something inside her had finally calcified into strength. I watched him destroy you, she said, her voice directed at me, but loud enough for everyone to hear. Every single day of your childhood, I watched it happen, and I said nothing. I did nothing. My father started to speak, but she held up a hand, and shockingly he stopped. When you were 10 years old, you won the regional science fair. You were so proud, so excited you could barely contain it. You came home with that blue ribbon and the certificate, and you showed it to your father. Her voice cracked, but she pushed through. He barely glanced at it. He said, "That's nice, Joanna." And then he turned to Lila, who'd gotten a participation ribbon in a dance recital, and spent 20 minutes telling her how talented she was, how special, how proud he was of her. I remembered that day. I remembered standing there with my ribbon, feeling it grow heavier and more meaningless by the second, wondering what I'd done wrong, why my achievement didn't matter. I told myself it wasn't that bad, Mother continued. That you were older, you didn't need as much praise. That he was just trying to boost Lila's confidence. I told myself lies because the truth was too uncomfortable to face. She looked at Father now, and there was something in her expression I'd never seen before, contempt. The truth was that you were systematically breaking our daughter's spirit, and I was letting you do it because I was too afraid to stop you. Margaret, this is not the time or place. Father's voice held warning, but Mother wasn't finished. You got into college with a partial scholarship. You were 17, so excited, talking about studying business administration, about making something of yourself. Her hands twisted together. You showed your father the acceptance letter, and he laughed. Actually laughed. He said a partial scholarship, if you were really smart, it would be a full ride. Clearly you're not that smart. And then he refused to help pay for the rest, said, if you wanted to go to college, you could figure out how to pay for it yourself. I'd worked 3 jobs that year. Waitressed at night, cleaned houses on weekends, tutored younger students between classes. I'd made it work, but barely. And I'd done it alone. I had money from my mother's inheritance, Margaret said, and this was new information, something I'd never known. $20,000 that she left specifically to me. I could have helped you. I should have helped you. But your father told me if I gave you a single dollar, he'd divorce me, leave me with nothing, make sure I never saw Lila again. And I believed him because, her voice broke completely now, because he controlled everything, every bank account, every credit card, every piece of financial security I had. I had no money of my own, no job skills after 20 years of being a housewife, no family nearby to help me. The room had gone completely still. Even Father had stopped trying to interrupt, maybe sensing that this dam, once broken, couldn't be stopped. He used money like a weapon, Mother said. Anytime I questioned how he treated you, anytime I suggested maybe he was being too hard, too cruel, he'd threaten to cut me off. Tell me I'd end up homeless, destitute, that no one would want a middle-aged woman with no skills and no income. And I was so afraid of being alone, of losing everything, that I chose silence. I chose my comfort over your safety, and I will never forgive myself for that. She walked across the room to where I sat, pulling something from her purse, a cream-colored envelope, aged and sealed. Your grandmother gave this to me 2 weeks before she died. She said, when the time is right, when Joanna needs it most, give her this. She knew. She knew what kind of man your father was, what kind of woman I'd become. And she trusted that someday I'd find the courage to do the right thing. Mother pressed the envelope into my hands, and her own hands were shaking so badly I had to steady them with mine. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry. I can't give you back your childhood. I can't undo the damage. But I can stop pretending it was acceptable. I can stop protecting him and start protecting you. She reached for the document on the table, the property deed, the ownership papers. Captain Pierce had brought up a notary earlier at my request, and she was standing quietly by the door. I want to sign whatever needs to be signed to formally acknowledge I have no claim to that land, that it's yours, completely and legally yours, and I support that. Margaret, don't be ridiculous, Father started. I'm not being ridiculous. I'm being honest for the first time in 40 years. She signed the waiver with firm, deliberate strokes, had it notarized, and placed it back on the table. I choose my daughter. I choose the truth. I choose to stop being complicit in your cruelty. Father's face had progressed from pale to red to something approaching purple. You're betraying your own husband. In front of strangers, in front of business associates, you're making me look like what you are, Mother said simply. A man who abused his daughter emotionally for her entire childhood, who manipulated his younger daughter into being his accomplice, who committed crimes to steal from his own child, who values his image more than his family's well-being. I'm not making you look like anything. I'm just finally telling the truth about what you've always been. Colin stood up quietly, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes sharp with judgment. I think I should excuse myself from this family matter. Ms. Hunter, thank you for your hospitality. Mr. Hunter, I'll be reconsidering our potential partnership. Father looked at me with pure hatred, now all pretense of paternal authority stripped away. You did this. You brought us all here to humiliate me, to destroy everything I've built, to turn my own family against me. No, I said quietly. You did this. I just stopped pretending it wasn't happening. You've all turned against me, he snarled, standing abruptly, his chair toppling backward. My own wife, my daughters, everyone. Fine. Fine. He was moving toward the door, his whole body rigid with rage. If this is how you want it, if you want to destroy this family, then... He stopped mid-sentence. His hand went to his chest, fingers clawing at his shirt. His face twisted, not with anger now, but with pain, genuine physical pain. And then he collapsed his knees, buckling his body, crumpling to the floor like a puppet with cut strings. The room erupted into chaos. Lila screamed. My mother gasped and rushed forward. Collins froze in the doorway, uncertain whether to stay or go. Raymond Chen was already moving toward the fallen figure, his movements surprisingly quick for his age. And I felt time slow down in that strange way it does during emergencies, every detail becoming hyper-real and crystalline. My father was on the floor, clutching his chest, his face gray, his breathing shallow and labored. This was a heart attack. I'd seen enough medical dramas to recognize the signs, but more than that, I'd taken emergency response training as part of my yacht ownership certification. I'd never expected to use it, certainly not like this. Captain Pierce, I said, my voice cutting through the panic with deliberate calm. Radio for medical helicopter evacuation immediately. Give them our exact coordinates and tell them we have a male patient, 65 years old, experiencing cardiac symptoms. I was already kneeling beside my father, checking his pulse, noting the rapid, irregular heartbeat. Someone get the emergency medical kit from the bridge. Now. A crew member sprinted away. Lila was on the floor beside me, sobbing hysterically, her hands hovering over Father's body without touching him, as if she was afraid any contact might make things worse. Please, she was saying over and over. Please, you have to save him. You have to do something, please. I am doing something. I told her, my fingers still on Father's pulse. But I need you to calm down and give me space to work. To Raymond, I said, help me get him flat on his back, head supported. We maneuvered him carefully while I loosened his collar, checked his airway, made sure he was breathing adequately, even if laboredly. The crew member returned with the medical kit, and I pulled out the oxygen mask, fitted it over Father's face, adjusted the flow. His color improved slightly, not much, but enough to buy time. Captain, what's the ETA on that helicopter? 20 minutes, came the response through the radio. They're launching now. 20 minutes. That was an eternity and an instant simultaneously. I went through Father's pockets, found his phone, scrolled through his contacts until I found his doctor, called and explained the situation. Listened to the doctor's rapid-fire questions and instructions. Yes, he had a history of high blood pressure. Yes, he was on medication, though I didn't know if he'd been taking it regularly. No, I didn't think he'd complained of chest pain before this moment. Does he have a nitroglycerin prescription? The doctor asked. I don't know. Mother, does he have nitroglycerin? My mother nodded frantically, pointing to Father's cabin. I dispatched another crew member to search for it, and they returned with a small bottle. The doctor walked me through administration, and I slipped a tablet under Father's tongue, hoping it would help, hoping I wasn't making anything worse. The yacht was already turning, heading toward the designated evacuation point, where the water was calm enough for a helicopter to hover safely. Captain Pierce was managing everything with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd handled emergencies at sea before. The crew had cleared the deck, prepared the landing area, moved all loose items that might be caught in the helicopter's downdraft. and I stayed kneeling beside my father, monitoring his breathing, his pulse, his color functioning on training and instinct, while my mind spun in odd, disconnected directions. I looked at him, truly, looked at him, and saw not the man who'd spent the last hour having his crimes exposed, but someone elderly and fragile and human. The skin on his hands was thin, spotted with age. His hair, which he dyed to hide the gray, showed white at the roots. His face, contorted with pain, held lines I'd never noticed before. Deep grooves carved by years of stress and anger and whatever drove him to be the kind of man who'd forge his daughter's signature. A memory surfaced, unbidden and unwelcome. I was 6 years old, standing at the edge of a lake at our summer cabin, terrified of the cold water. My father had waded in, turned back with arms outstretched, and said, "Come on, Joanna. I won't let you sink, I promise." And I'd believed him. I'd jumped and he'd caught me, and he'd taught me to float, to kick, to trust the water. "You're so brave," he'd told me that day, and I'd glowed with the warmth of his approval. That father had disappeared sometime between that summer and Lila's birth a year later. Or maybe he'd never really existed at all. Maybe I'd just been young enough to not see the control, the manipulation, the way his love was always conditional, always transactional. But that memory hurt worse than all the later betrayals because it reminded me what I'd lost, or what I'd thought I had. The helicopter arrived exactly 20 minutes later, a thunder of rotors and organized chaos. Paramedics descended with a stretcher and equipment, taking over with calm professionalism. They asked questions. I answered age, symptoms, medications, treatments already administered. They loaded him onto the stretcher with practiced efficiency, started an IV-attached monitoring equipment. My mother followed them toward the helicopter, her face streaked with tears, torn between the habit of 40 years and the truth she'd finally spoken. Lila clung to me, literally holding onto my arm, asking, "What happens now? What do we do? What if he dies? What will happen to us?" The questions revealed everything about how she'd lived, always depending on someone else to provide answers, to solve problems, to handle the difficult decisions. At 28, she had no idea how to exist without someone else's structure, someone else's approval, someone else's money. "He's going to get the best medical care available," I told her, trying to be gentle. "That's what happens now. After that, we'll deal with whatever comes next." The paramedics had father almost to the helicopter when he briefly regained consciousness. His eyes opened, unfocused and confused, scanning faces until they landed on mine. His hand shot out, gripping my wrist with surprising strength for someone having a heart attack, and he pulled me closer. His voice, when it came, was raspy and barely audible beneath the oxygen mask. "You owe me," he said. Each word was an effort forced out between labored breaths. "I gave you life. You owe me." I looked at his hand on my wrist, the hand that had signed my forged signature, that had pushed me away 1,000 times, that had never quite held me the way it held Lila. I gently but firmly removed his fingers one by one until my wrist was free. "No," I said quietly, close enough that only he could hear me over the helicopter noise. "I don't. Not anymore." His eyes widened, shock or anger or understanding, I couldn't tell. And then the paramedics were moving again, loading him into the helicopter. My mother climbed in beside him, and the door slid shut. The aircraft lifted off, tilting slightly as it gained altitude, then banking toward the mainland, toward the hospital, toward whatever came next. We stood on the deck, watching it disappear, a shrinking speck against the morning sky. Lila was still crying, leaning heavily against me, and I put my arm around her because despite everything, she was still my sister, still someone who'd been damaged by the same man who'd damaged me, just differently. Raymond Chen stood nearby, a quiet presence of solidarity. Collins had long since retreated to his cabin. The crew moved to clean up and resume normal operations, giving us space for our grief or relief, or whatever this complicated emotion was. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, saw James's name on the screen. A text message marked urgent. "Just found something about Lila you need to see. It involves a hospital and records from 6 months ago. Call me immediately." I looked at my sister, still clinging to me, still sobbing, still so young despite being 28, and felt my stomach drop with the certainty that this day's revelations weren't over yet. I waited until Lila had retreated to her cabin before calling James back. His voice was tight with the particular tension that came from uncovering information he wished he hadn't found. "I've been doing deep background on everyone involved, trying to understand the full scope of your father's financial situation. Lila co-signed that loan document so her banking records were relevant to the fraud investigation." "And you found something," I said, already knowing the answer. "Medical expenses from 6 months ago, substantial ones, an OB/GYN clinic, a surgical center, follow-up appointments. The billing codes." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "They're consistent with pregnancy termination, and there are text messages between Lila and your father in the phone records we pulled. They reference an appointment, him picking her up, making sure she went through with it. I'm sending you the files now." I sat in the master suite reviewing the documents, feeling something cold and heavy settle in my chest. Bank statements showing payments to women's health associates. Text messages that were coded but clear enough if you knew what to look for. "Did you make the appointment?" "Yes, Tuesday at 2 p.m. Don't be late." "I went. It's done. Are you happy now?" "We don't discuss this again. Ever." I found Lila an hour later on the forward deck, sitting with her knees pulled to her chest, staring out at the water. Her eyes were red and swollen, her expensive makeup completely destroyed by crying. She looked younger than 28, looked like the little girl I remembered following me around when she was 4, before father had taught her that loving me meant betraying herself. I sat down beside her, not touching, just being present. "Lila, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." She didn't look at me. "About what?" "About 6 months ago. About a pregnancy." I kept my voice gentle, non-judgmental. "About what father made you do." Her entire body went rigid. The silence stretched so long I thought she might not answer, might deny it, might retreat back into the lies that had protected her for so long. Then her face crumpled and she buried it in her hands, shoulders shaking with sobs that sounded like they'd been held in for half a year. "How did you know?" she finally managed through her tears. "My lawyer found the medical records during the fraud investigation. Lila, I'm not here to judge you. I'm here because I think there's more to this story than you've been allowed to tell anyone." The words came out in broken pieces, punctuated by tears and long pauses where she had to gather the strength to continue. She'd been dating Marcus, a jazz pianist she'd met at a gallery opening, someone who made her laugh and treated her like she was interesting rather than just decorative. Father had disapproved. Immediately, musicians were unstable, unreliable, wouldn't provide the kind of life his daughter deserved. But Lila had kept seeing him secretly, and when she'd missed her period, when the test came back positive, she'd felt terrified but also strangely hopeful. "I thought maybe this could be mine," she said, her voice raw. "Something that wasn't about father's approval or what looked good for the family. Just mine." She'd told father first, hoping somehow he'd surprise her, support her, help her figure out what to do. Instead, he'd gone cold, that particular coldness that was worse than rage. "You will terminate this pregnancy immediately," he'd said. "You're not married, the father is completely inappropriate, and I will not have this family's reputation destroyed by your poor choices." When she'd tried to refuse, tried to say it was her decision, he'd made the consequences crystal clear. "If you keep this pregnancy, you're no longer my daughter. No home, no money, no family. I'll make sure your mother never speaks to you again, that you're cut off from everything and everyone you've ever known. You'll be completely alone trying to raise a child with no resources, no support, and a boyfriend who'll abandon you the moment things get hard." She was 27 years old, with no job skills, no savings of her own, no identity separate from being Richard Hunter's daughter. The threat of complete abandonment, of losing everything she'd ever known, had been devastating. He scheduled the appointment himself. Lila said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Drove me there, walked me to the door, told me he'd be waiting when I was done. I went into that clinic alone and I came out alone and he acted like nothing had happened. Like I hadn't just, She couldn't finish the sentence. Afterward, Marcus kept calling and Father made me block his number. I never got to tell him about the pregnancy, never got to explain why I suddenly cut off all contact. Father just erased him from my life like he'd never existed. I felt my anger at Lila shifting, restructuring into something more complex. She hadn't been the villain of my story. She'd been another victim, just in a different way. Father had broken me by withholding love, had broken her by making love conditional on complete obedience. Same abuse, different methods. I resented you so much. Lila continued, looking at me now with red, swollen eyes. You got out. You escaped. And I was stuck being the perfect daughter, doing everything right, losing pieces of myself one by one. When Father asked me to sabotage your career years ago, when he told me to send those emails saying you were unstable and couldn't be trusted, part of me felt like if I couldn't be free, at least I could make sure you weren't either. At least I could keep you from rubbing your freedom in my face. I didn't know, I said quietly. I thought you just hated me. I hated that you were brave enough to leave. I hated that you chose yourself when I never could. She wiped her face with shaking hands. And now I've realized that being the golden child was just another kind of cage. At least you knew where you stood. I spent my whole life thinking I was loved, and it turns out I was just useful. We sat in silence, two sisters who'd been turned against each other by a man who'd valued control more than connection. The sun was high now, warming the deck, and somewhere below I could hear the crew preparing lunch. Normal life continuing while everything fundamental shifted beneath us. There's something else, Lila said, pulling out her phone with trembling hands. A few nights before this trip, I couldn't sleep. I went to get water and heard Father on the phone in his study. He didn't know I was there. I recorded it because I don't know why. Something about his voice scared me. She pulled up an audio file, her thumb hovering over the play button. I didn't understand what he was talking about then. But now, after everything that's happened today, Joanna, I think he was planning to have you committed, to take away your legal rights completely. She pressed play. The audio quality was muffled, distant, clearly recorded through a door or from another room. But Father's voice came through clearly enough. I recognized the tone, cold, calculating, the one he used when discussing business strategies that skirted ethical boundaries. If Joanna refuses to cooperate with the land sale, we move to Plan B. A pause, ice clinking in a glass. I've already prepared the documentation. Dr. Morrison owes me several favors from that malpractice situation I helped him navigate. He'll sign the psychiatric evaluation stating she poses a danger to herself. Another voicemail unfamiliar to me. You're talking about an involuntary commitment order. That's extreme, Richard. If it goes wrong, it won't go wrong. 72-hour hold extendable if necessary. While she's detained and under psychiatric observation, I activate the emergency power of attorney as her closest living relative. Her assets get frozen, business decisions suspended, everything put on hold, pending mental health evaluation. Father's voice held a satisfaction that made my skin crawl. By the time she's released and cleared, I'll have sold the property, cleared the debts, and restructured everything. And who's going to believe her afterward? She'll look exactly like what the paperwork says, paranoid, unstable, making wild accusations against her concerned father. What if she lawyers up immediately? Let her. The optics are terrible, successful daughter suddenly claiming her elderly father is conspiring against her, refusing to accept medical intervention, becoming combative with healthcare professionals. Every action she takes to defend herself will be reframed as further evidence of instability. It's perfect, really. The recording ended. Lila was shaking her phone clutched in both hands. I didn't understand what it meant at the time. I thought maybe he was talking about a business rival, someone else. But it was you. He was planning to have you declared mentally incompetent. My hands had gone numb. This wasn't just theft or fraud. This was something darker, more invasive. He'd been planning to strip away my autonomy entirely, to use the medical system as a weapon to erase my legal existence until he'd taken everything he wanted. And the worst part was how close he'd come to pulling it off. If I'd shown up at that dock in anger, if I'd made a scene, if I'd given him any ammunition at all, I pulled out my phone, called Marcus with shaking fingers. He answered on the first ring. "Ms. Hunter, is everything all right? I saw the news about a medical helicopter." "Marcus, I need you to tell me something. In the past few months, has anyone approached you or the company asking unusual questions about me?" A pause. "Actually, yes. About 3 weeks ago, a man claiming to be a journalist came to the office. Said he was writing a piece about women entrepreneurs in the luxury hospitality industry. He asked our receptionist a lot of questions about you, your work habits, your decision-making process, whether you'd ever shown signs of erratic behavior or instability." "What did she tell him?" "Nothing, thankfully. She flagged it as suspicious because legitimate journalists usually go through proper PR channels. I made a note of it, but didn't think it was serious. Should I have? No, you did exactly right." I closed my eyes, seeing the pieces fall into place. That wasn't a journalist. That was reconnaissance. Someone building a case file, gathering evidence to support a psychiatric evaluation. Jesus! For what purpose? To have me declared incompetent. To take control of my assets while I was detained for evaluation. I explained the recording, the plan, how close Father had come to executing it. Marcus was silent for a long moment. "Your composure at the dock. The way you refused to engage when he was baiting you. That probably saved you." He was right. Father had expected rage, expected me to fight back emotionally, to give him the erratic behavior he needed to justify the commitment order. Instead, I'd stayed calm, professional, controlled. What he'd mistaken for weakness had actually been my shield against his most dangerous weapon. I looked at Lila, who was watching me with an expression of dawning horror. "He would have done the same thing to you eventually," I told her gently. "The moment you stepped out of line, showed too much independence, threatened his control. You would have been the unstable one, the one who needed intervention for your own good." "I know," she whispered. "I'm starting to understand that now. Being the golden child just meant I was more useful to him. But the moment I stopped being useful, you'd become the problem that needed to be solved." I reached over and took her hand. "Lila, this recording is evidence. Along with everything else, it shows a pattern of manipulation and abuse. But if you testify, if you go on record about all of this, he'll come after you. He'll use every tactic he's ever used on me." "I know." She was crying again, but there was something different in her expression now. Determination underneath the fear. "But I can't keep being his accomplice. I can't keep letting him use me to hurt people, including myself. I don't even know who I am without his approval, and that's scarier than anything he could do to me." "It is scary," I agreed. "But it's also the beginning of freedom. Will you help me?" Her voice was small, uncertain, the voice of someone who'd never had to navigate the world alone. "I don't know how to do any of this. I don't know how to have a job or pay bills or make decisions without checking if they're what he wants. I don't know how to be a person instead of a performance." "Yes," I said, squeezing her hand. "But you have to understand it's going to be hard. Really hard. You'll have to learn things you should have learned at 18. You'll have to fail at stuff and figure out how to get back up. You'll have to build a life from scratch. Will you teach me? I'll teach you everything I know. But Lila, you have to actually do the work. I can't do it for you." "I will. I promise I will." She was still shaking, but her jaw was set. "I want to testify. About the forgery, about the pregnancy, about this recording, about everything. I want him to face consequences. And I need to stop being the person he made me." My phone rang, cutting through the moment. Unknown number, local area code. I answered cautiously. "Hello? Ms. Hunter." "This is Nurse Patterson from Coastal Regional Hospital. Your father has regained consciousness and is demanding actually to see you immediately. He's threatening to check himself out against medical advice if you don't come. He says," the nurse's voice dropped uncomfortable. "He says he has something that will change your mind about everything, that you'll want to hear what he has to say." I looked at Lila at the phone with its damning recording at the horizon where the hospital sat on the mainland. One more confrontation, one more manipulation attempt. But this time, I wouldn't be walking into it blind. "Tell him I'll be there in 2 hours," I said. "And tell him if he checks himself out before I arrive, I'll be filing criminal charges immediately. He can decide which matters more, his health or his pride." I didn't go to the hospital immediately. Instead, I spent the next hour working with James via video call, methodically securing every piece of evidence, every legal advantage, every protection I could think of, before facing my father again. We filed preliminary ownership documents with the county recorder, establishing a clear public record that the Hillside Road property belonged to me, and that any attempt to sell it without my explicit written consent would be void. James worked with a forensic IT specialist to properly preserve Lila's audio recording with full chain of custody documentation, ensuring it would be admissible in court if needed. We created encrypted backups of everything: Will's bank records, text messages, the forgery analysis, and stored them in multiple secure locations. But something still nagged at me, a question I couldn't quite articulate. James, why is he this desperate? The debt is bad. I understand that, but the urgency, the elaborate schemes, the risks he's taking, it feels disproportionate to what we know. James was quiet for a moment, his fingers drumming on his desk in that way he did when he was thinking through legal puzzles. "You're right. The timeline doesn't quite add up. He's been pushing to sell the land for months, maybe longer, based on what we've found. But if it's just about covering business debts, there would be other options, other assets he could liquidate first." He leaned forward. "I think we need to understand exactly what that land is worth. Not just market value for undeveloped property, but comprehensive value. Mineral rights, development potential, everything. Can you arrange that? I'll have a full geological and environmental survey done. It'll take a few days, but if there's something there beyond sentimental value, we'll find it." 3 days later, while the yacht was docked for restocking, and Father was still recovering in the hospital, under careful observation, I received a call from James with an edge of excitement in his voice I'd never heard before. "You need to see this report immediately. I'm sending it now." I opened the geological survey on my laptop, scanning through technical language about soil composition and water tables and mineral content, not understanding most of it until I reached the executive summary. Then I read it again slowly, making sure I wasn't misunderstanding. The property at 487 Hillside Road sat atop a moderate-sized lithium deposit. The technical specifications meant nothing to me, but the estimated value did. If mining rights were developed and extraction proved economically viable, the deposit could be worth between $50 and $80 million at current market rates. With the electric vehicle boom driving demand for lithium batteries, that value could potentially double within 5 years. $50 to $80 million. My grandmother's little 3 acres of peace and roses and porch swings sat on top of a fortune. I kept reading, my hands shaking slightly. The geological formation had only been recently mapped using new technology. 5 years ago, a mining exploration company called TerraCore Resources had conducted preliminary surveys in the region and identified several properties of interest, including my grandmother's land. I found their letter in the supplementary documents. James had compiled a polite inquiry sent to Eleanor Mason, asking if she'd be interested in discussing mineral rights, leasing, or property sale for development purposes. Attached to that letter was a handwritten note in my grandmother's distinctive script, presumably written to her lawyer or to Raymond, someone she trusted. "They want to turn my sanctuary into a pit in the ground. They talk about responsible extraction and minimal environmental impact. But I've seen what mining does to land. They don't want the property, they want to hollow it out and leave a scar. My son will sell it to them in a heartbeat if he finds out. He sees only dollar signs where I see 50 years of memories. Joanna will understand. She knows some legacies cannot be measured in profit margins. I sat back, the pieces finally assembling into a complete picture. Father had found out about the lithium somehow, maybe through business contacts, maybe through the same regional surveys that had tipped off TerraCore. He'd seen those numbers, that potential wealth, and known he had to move fast before anyone questioned his authority to sell. The forged loan documents, the urgency with Collins, the desperate schemes, it all made sense now. This wasn't just about covering debts. This was about accessing a fortune he thought should be his. A fortune that would solve every financial problem he'd created through bad decisions and worse investments. And my grandmother had known. Had seen exactly what would happen, had structured everything specifically to keep this land out of his hands. She'd given it to me not because I was her favorite, though maybe I was, but because she trusted me to understand what mattered more than money. She'd trusted me to choose preservation over profit memory, over mining legacy, over liquidation. I pulled up the property records again, looking at the satellite images of where her house had once stood. You could still see the outline of her garden in the different colors of vegetation, the path she'd walked every morning, the clearing where we'd watched stars together. All of it sitting on top of a mineral deposit worth more money than I'd ever imagined. My phone rang. Marcus. His voice tight with a different kind of urgency. Ms. Hunter, you need to see the news. That video from the doc, your cousin posted it online and it's everywhere. 3 million views in the last 48 hours and climbing exponentially. News outlets are picking it up, social media is exploding with it, and we're getting calls from journalists wanting your side of the story. What video? I asked, though I already knew. Tyler with his phone recording my humiliation, thinking it was just family drama to share with friends. Your father at the dock calling you a failure, saying you don't deserve to be on the trip, replacing you with the housekeeper. It's being framed as a story about family abuse, about successful women being dismissed by toxic fathers. There are think pieces being written, family psychologists analyzing it, advocacy groups sharing it as an example of narcissistic family dynamics. Marcus paused. Some people are trying to identify you to find out who you are and how the story ended. Do you want me to prepare a statement? I looked at the geological report still open on my screen, at my grandmother's note about legacies and profit margins, at the satellite image of land that held both my happiest memories and a fortune that could change everything. I thought about my father in his hospital bed, probably watching that same video go viral, seeing his carefully constructed image crumble in real time. I thought about the choice in front of me, wealth beyond imagination, or a promise to someone who'd loved me unconditionally. Not yet, I told Marcus. But start drafting options. I think this story is about to get a lot more complicated. Lila and I arrived at Coastal Regional Hospital together, a united front I doubt my father anticipated. We'd spent the drive in relative silence, both of us processing everything that had been revealed, both of us preparing for what came next. Captain Pierce had arranged for the yacht to dock temporarily at the nearest marina, and I'd rented a car for this trip. Lila sat in the passenger seat with her phone in her lap, the audio recording that could destroy our father cued and ready. She looked terrified and determined in equal measure. We found Father in a private room on the cardiac care floor, sitting up in bed despite the IV lines and monitoring equipment. He'd shaved, combed his hair, put on his reading glasses, all the small gestures of a man trying to reclaim dignity in a hospital gown. When we entered, his expression shifted through surprise, calculation, and finally settled on something that might have looked like vulnerability to someone who didn't know better. Joanna, Lila, I'm glad you both came. His voice was weaker than usual, raspier, but his eyes were sharp. I've had a lot of time to think lying here. About family, about priorities, about what really matters when you're facing your own mortality. I pulled a chair close to the bed, sat down, kept my expression neutral. Lila stood near the door as if ready to flee if necessary. What did you want to tell me, Father? The nurse said you had something that would change my mind about everything. I almost died, Joanna. That tends to give a man perspective. He reached for the water cup on his bedside table with a hand that trembled slightly, whether from genuine weakness or performance I couldn't tell. Family debts, business pressures, bad investments, these things pile up. That land your grandmother left you, it could solve everything. We could settle the debts, start fresh, rebuild together as a family. You want me to sell grandmother's land so you can cover your losses. I want us to make a smart financial decision as a family, together. The vulnerability was sliding away now, replaced by the harder edge I recognized. But if you won't do this willingly, if you insist on being difficult, then you need to understand something. I have connections in this town, in this state. People who owe me favors. One phone call and your business becomes very complicated. Permits delayed indefinitely, inspections that find violations. Questions about your company's legitimacy. Your reputation destroyed before you know what hit you. There it was, the threat barely concealed beneath a thin veneer of paternal concern. Lila made a small sound of distress, but I stayed perfectly calm. "Make the call," I said evenly. "Please, I'd be very interested to see what happens." His eyes narrowed, uncertain if I was bluffing. I reached into my bag, pulled out my laptop, and opened it. "Actually, before you do that, let me show you something." I'd asked the hospital staff earlier if I could connect my laptop to the room's television for a family meeting they'd been accommodating, probably assuming it was for medical information or end-of-life planning. Now I pulled up the first document, and it filled the large screen mounted on the wall. The forensic analysis of my forged signature side-by-side comparisons the examiner's conclusion in bold text. "This is evidence of forgery and fraud. Multiple felonies." Father's face lost some color. I pulled up the next document, bank records, loan applications, the timeline of his crimes. "This is the paper trail. Every illegal transaction, every forged document, every law you broke thinking you'd never be caught. Joanna, you can't possibly—" "I'm not finished." I played the doc video next, the one that had gone viral. His voice filled the room, calling me a failure, an embarrassment, someone who didn't deserve to be on his yacht trip. 3 million people have watched you publicly humiliate me. The comment sections are quite revealing about public opinion regarding fathers like you. Then I played Lila's recording. His voice again discussing Plan B, the psychiatric hold, stripping away my legal autonomy, erasing my ability to fight back. The color drained completely from his face now. You can't use that, it's..." The door opened. Raymond Chen entered, followed by my mother, both of them positioned exactly where I'd asked them to be, arriving precisely on time. "Mr. Hunter," Raymond said quietly, "I'm prepared to testify about your mother's true intentions regarding that property, about the will you never knew existed." My mother stood beside him, her hands clasped together, but her voice steady. "And I'm prepared to testify about 40 years of financial abuse, coercion, and control. About watching you systematically destroy our daughter's self-worth. About everything I should have said decades ago." Father looked around the room at me, with my laptop full of evidence, at Lila standing by the door with her phone containing his recorded confession, at Raymond and Margaret prepared to testify against him, at the hospital TV screen still displaying his crimes. Every avenue of manipulation, every tool of control, every weapon he'd ever used was now pointed back at him. "You're all turning on me," he said, and there was something almost like bewilderment in his voice. "My own family. Everything I built. Everything I provided. Everything you built on lies and abuse," I interrupted. "And now you have a choice. 48 hours to decide. Option 1, you liquidate your remaining assets, the house, the cars, the investments you haven't already gambled away to repay the fraudulent loan in full. You sign legal documents permanently relinquishing any claim to grandmother's property. You agree to a restraining order preventing contact with Lila and me for 5 years. In exchange, I don't press criminal charges." "You can't be serious." "Option 2, I file reports with the FBI for bank fraud, with local prosecutors for forgery and identity theft. You face trial, probable conviction, 5 to 10 years in federal prison. Your reputation destroyed, your freedom gone, your last years spent behind bars." I closed my laptop, stood up. 48 hours. Your lawyer can contact mine. Those are the only 2 options you have." "You'd send your own father to prison?" His voice cracked on the last word, genuine emotion breaking through for perhaps the first time. After everything, you'd destroy your own family. I looked at him for a long moment. This man who'd shaped my entire childhood around his rejection, who'd committed crimes rather than see me succeed, who'd planned to have me declared incompetent to steal what little my grandmother had protected for me. No, Father, I'm giving you a choice to take responsibility for your actions. You're the one who'll decide what happens next. Just like you decided to forge my signature to manipulate Lila to scheme and steal and abuse everyone around you. I moved toward the door where Lila waited. The difference is, this time you'll face consequences for your choices, and I won't carry guilt for that anymore. We walked out together, Lila and I, leaving him in that hospital bed with 48 hours to choose between accountability and prison. My mother and Raymond followed, closing the door softly behind them. In the parking lot, my phone rang. James, his voice tight. The clock is running, but you should know your father just called his lawyer from the hospital. And based on phone records we're monitoring with legal authority, he also made a call to someone at a tabloid news outlet. I think he's planning a media counterattack. I looked back at the hospital building unsurprised. Of course he wouldn't go quietly. Of course he'd try to manipulate public opinion to paint himself as the victim, to use every weapon left in his arsenal. Let him try, I said. We have truth on our side, and this time people are already watching. The article hit within 3 hours of leaving the hospital. Marcus sent it to me with a terse message. This is bad. We need to respond. I opened the link, read through the piece with growing recognition of my father's particular style of manipulation, his talent for selective truth-telling that constructed elaborate lies. Successful entrepreneur abandons ailing father in hospital, family sources. Claim financial exploitation and elder abuse. The byline was from a regional tabloid known for sensational stories with minimal fact-checking. The article painted a vivid picture: an elderly man recovering from a near-fatal heart attack, whose wealthy daughter had descended on the family, demanding control of assets and threatening legal action while he lay helpless in a hospital bed. Anonymous family sources. Father's business associates undoubtedly expressed concern about his daughter's sudden interest in the family estate and questioned her motives. The article mentioned the Yacht, my company, carefully implying I'd built my wealth through questionable means and was now targeting my vulnerable father for more. Social media picked it up quickly. The initial wave of comments was exactly what father had hoped for: outrage at an ungrateful daughter, sympathy for an ailing parent, speculation about greed and family betrayal. Disgusting how some people treat their parents. Money changes people. He gave her life, and this is how she repays him. I sat in the penthouse living room, laptop open, watching the narrative spread across platforms. Marcus paced behind me, agitated. We need to issue a statement, correct the record, show the evidence of forgery, the abuse, everything. Not yet. I kept my voice calm, though my heart was racing. Let him overplay his hand. Give him enough rope. Joanna, your reputation will survive because the truth is already out there. I pulled up the doc video, still circulating on different platforms now with millions more views. People are already starting to make connections. And they were. In the comment sections beneath the tabloid article, newer voices appeared linking to the doc video. Wait, isn't this the same father who publicly humiliated his daughter at a marina? I saw that video. He called her a failure and replaced her with the housekeeper. Something doesn't add up here. The narrative was beginning to fracture, people starting to question the convenient timing of father's victimhood claims. That evening, Lila and my mother arrived at the penthouse with suitcases. I'd offered them space to stay while everything unfolded somewhere away from father's house, from the neighbors' questions, from the weight of all those years in that building. They stood in my doorway, looking uncertain, like refugees from their own lives. This is beautiful, Lila said softly, walking through the space with something like wonder. She touched the furniture gently, looked out at the harbor view, examined the art on my walls. You built all of this, by yourself. With help from good people, I corrected. But yes, I built it. My mother sat on the couch, her hands in her lap, looking around like she was trying to memorize everything. I didn't know. I didn't know any of this existed. Your whole life happening without us. Without him, I said. It had to be without him. We fell into an uneasy routine over the next 2 days. 3 women who'd lived in the same house for 18 years, but had never really lived together now, navigating shared space with cautious politeness. Lila asked questions constantly. How did I manage my finances? How did I negotiate contracts? How did I make decisions without consulting anyone? Father always decided everything, she explained. What I wore, who I dated, what job opportunities I could accept. I don't actually know how to choose for myself. My mother confessed she'd never balanced a checkbook, never paid bills online, never filed taxes independently. Your father handled everything. I signed where he told me to sign. I didn't even know how much money we had or didn't have until recently. So we started there. Basic financial literacy, simple budgeting exercises, discussions about autonomy and decision-making. It was strange and healing at the same time, building something new from the wreckage of what we'd been. On social media, the tide was turning more decisively. Internet sleuths had found Father's business history lawsuits from former partners, complaints from vendors, a pattern of financial disputes that painted a very different picture from the sympathetic victim in the tabloid article. Someone found records of the family foundation he'd bragged about discovering. It existed only on paper and had never actually distributed charitable funds. A women's advocacy blog called Daughters of Narcissists published a detailed analysis of the doc video identifying classic patterns of family scapegoating, golden child dynamics, and public humiliation as control tactics. This is textbook narcissistic family structure, the blogger wrote. The scapegoat daughter who actually succeeds despite being told she's worthless. The golden child trapped in a gilded cage. The enabling mother finally breaking free. And the patriarch who'd rather destroy his children than lose control of them. The post went viral, shared hundreds of thousands of times, resonating with women who recognized these patterns from their own families. By the morning of the 48-hour deadline, public opinion had shifted dramatically. Comments on the tabloid article now mostly defended me, calling out Father's manipulation, sharing similar stories of family abuse disguised as concern. Someone had started a hashtag, I was the scapegoat too, and it was trending with thousands of stories from daughters and sons dismissed by their families, told they weren't good enough, pushed aside for the golden children. My phone rang at exactly 8 a.m. James, his voice carrying a mixture of relief and caution. He's made his decision. His lawyer just sent over signed documents, the asset liquidation plan, the property rights waiver, everything we demanded. It's done. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. So, no criminal charges. He chose accountability. With a condition. James paused. He wants to see you one more time. Alone. No lawyers, no family, no witnesses. His lawyer says he has something he needs to tell you that no one else can hear. Something about your grandmother. I looked out at the harbor, at the morning sun painting the water gold, at the city waking up to another day. Lila was in the guest room, still asleep. My mother was in the kitchen making coffee, humming softly to herself for the first time I could remember. And somewhere across town, my father was waiting to deliver whatever final manipulation or truth or weapon he thought he had left. Tell him I'll come, I said. This afternoon. But if it's another scheme, if he's planning anything, the deal is off and I file charges immediately. Understood. Joanna, be careful. Cornered animals are the most dangerous. I ended the call and stood there for a long moment, preparing myself for one last confrontation. One final conversation with the man who'd shaped my entire life by trying to break me. Whatever he wanted to say, whatever truth or lie he'd saved for this moment, I would face it the way I'd learned to face everything else, with my eyes open and my spine straight, owing him nothing but my presence. I arrived at the hospital at 3 in the afternoon alone as requested. The cardiac floor was quiet during visiting hours, a hushed institutional calm that felt both peaceful and suffocating. Father's room looked different than it had 2 days ago. The flowers had wilted cards from business associates unopened on the windowsill, a tray of barely touched food pushed to the side. He sat propped up in bed, looking smaller, somehow older, the hospital gown and IV lines stripping away the armor of expensive clothing and controlled environments. "You came," he said, and there was something in his voice I couldn't quite identify. Not gratitude, but perhaps surprise that I'd kept my word. "You signed the papers. That was the agreement." I sat in the chair beside his bed, maintaining distance but present. "James said you have something to tell me about grandmother." "I do. But first..." He gestured vaguely at the documents on his bedside table, the legal agreements that would strip him of nearly everything. "You won. Everything you wanted. The land, the truth, your revenge. You won." "This wasn't about winning," I said quietly. "This was about stopping you from hurting people. There's a difference." He was silent for a long moment, staring at his hands, the veins prominent under papery skin. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight I'd never heard before, something like exhaustion mixed with reluctant honesty. "My father, your grandfather, was a hard man. Believed boys had to be tough, that gentleness was weakness, that showing emotion meant you'd never survive in this world." He looked up at me, and his eyes held something that might have been pain. "He beat me for crying, for being sensitive, for caring too much about things that didn't make money. He used to say, 'The world will eat you alive if you don't learn to be harder than everyone else.'" I stayed silent, letting him continue. "When you were born, I felt something I hadn't expected. Tenderness. Protection. Love, maybe, though I barely recognized it." His voice roughened. "But every time I held you, every time I felt that softness, I heard my father's voice mocking me, calling me weak, telling me I was raising you wrong, that daughters didn't matter anyway, that I was wasting emotion on someone who'd just leave and take another man's name." He paused, struggling with something, honesty maybe, or just the effort of explaining decades of damage. "When Lila was born, I was failing in business. Everything my father said, I'd be a weak man, a failure, someone who couldn't hack it in the real world, seemed to be coming true. I thought if I could make Lila perfect, publicly successful, admired, it would prove him wrong. Prove I wasn't a failure as a father." "And I reminded you of yourself," I said, understanding clicking into place. "You were sensitive, thoughtful, always trying so hard to please everyone, to be good enough. I saw my own weakness in you, and I..." He stopped, swallowed hard. "I tried to beat it out of you the way my father beat it out of me. Not with fists, with words, with dismissal, with making sure you never felt secure in your worth. And when I succeeded anyway," I continued for him, "when I built something without your help, without your approval, it proved you were wrong. It proved your father was wrong. That's why you tried to tear it down. Because if you could thrive without me, it meant I'd been unnecessary all along. That all the cruelty, all the control, all the years of making you feel worthless, it had been for nothing. You didn't need me. You were better off without me." He said it like a confession, like the worst truth he'd ever had to admit. We sat in silence, the machines beeping softly, measuring his heart rate, his oxygen levels, the continuing function of a body that had nearly given out under the weight of its own rage. Finally, he reached under his pillow and pulled out something small, a brass key, old-fashioned, with intricate engravings along its shaft. "Your grandmother gave this to me 10 years ago. Told me to give it to you when the time was right, when she was ready. I kept it as insurance, as potential leverage, thinking someday I'd need it." He held it out, and I took it carefully, feeling its weight in my palm. "Whatever it opens, she meant for you to have. She knew what kind of man I'd become. She was protecting you from me, even before you were born." I examined the key, seeing numbers engraved along its base, a box number, a bank code. "What does it open?" "Safe deposit box. First National Bank downtown. I never accessed it, never knew what was inside, but your grandmother said—" He paused, something flickering across his face. "She said it contained the real reason she trusted only you with her legacy, that when you found it you'd understand everything." I stood pocketing the key. There was nothing left to say. No forgiveness to offer, no reconciliation to perform. Understanding someone's trauma didn't erase their choices, didn't absolve them of responsibility for the pain they'd caused. As I reached the door, he spoke one last time. "The key opens a safe deposit box at First National Bank downtown. But be prepared, what your grandmother left there isn't just documents. It's the real reason she trusted only you with her legacy." I called Raymond from the hospital parking lot. He met me at First National Bank an hour later, his presence both comforting and ceremonial, as if he understood this moment required a witness, even if I needed privacy for what came after. The bank manager verified my identity, checked the key against their records, and led us to a private viewing room where safe deposit boxes could be accessed in quiet dignity. Inside the long metal box lay pieces of my grandmother's secret life, a leather journal worn soft with handling, its pages yellowed and filled with her careful handwriting. A manila envelope thick with cash that, when I counted it later, totaled exactly $50,000 in $100 bills. Photographs of her as a young woman smiling with hope that hadn't yet been beaten out of her. And a sealed letter with my name written across it in her distinctive script, the ink slightly faded but still legible. Raymond squeezed my shoulder gently. "Take all the time you need. I'll be in the lobby when you're ready." He left, closing the door softly behind him, and I was alone with my grandmother's final gift. I opened the letter first, needing her voice to guide me through whatever came next. "My dearest Joanna," it began. "If you're reading this, I am gone. But I hope I have given you something more permanent than my presence, the truth, and a choice." She explained that the journal contained her full story, the parts she'd never been able to speak aloud. The money was for emergencies, for escape, for starting over if I ever needed to run. The photographs were to remind me that she'd once been young and hopeful too, before the world taught her that hope could be dangerous. I set the letter aside and opened the journal to its first page, dated 1955, the year she married my grandfather. The early entries were full of romance and dreams. A young woman in love, planning a future, describing her new husband's smile and the way he made her feel safe. Then, slowly, the entries changed. Her husband's temper first dismissed as stress from work. His criticism rationalized as him wanting her to be her best self. The first time he raised his hand to her, followed by apologies and promises, it would never happen again. But it did happen again. And again. For decades. The journal documented systematic abuse, physical violence that left bruises she covered with makeup and long sleeves, emotional cruelty that convinced her she deserved it, financial control that left her with no money to leave even when she finally wanted to. She described the social pressure of the 1950s and 60s, when divorced women were treated as failures, when admitting abuse meant admitting your own inadequacy as a wife, when everyone from her family to her pastor told her to pray harder and be more submissive. Most painfully, she wrote about watching her son, my father, learn cruelty from his father. "I see my husband in my boy now," she wrote when my father was 12. "The way he speaks to smaller children, the way he treats animals, the way he's learning that power comes from making others feel small. I tried to protect him from his father's violence, but in protecting him, I taught him that violence works, that cruelty gets results. I have failed him, and he is becoming the thing I most feared." When I was born, her entries shifted again. A granddaughter. Perhaps this is my chance at redemption. I cannot save my son, he is his father's son now, and no words of mine can reach him. But maybe I can save her. Maybe I can teach her she's worthy without having to earn it. Maybe I can give her tools my generation never had: education, financial literacy, the understanding that she doesn't need a man's permission to exist. The later entries, written in increasingly shaky handwriting as illness progressed, focused on building resources specifically for me. She'd opened secret accounts, saved money from her household allowance dollar by dollar, purchased the land with an inheritance from her own mother that my grandfather never knew about. "I'm leaving her more than property," she wrote. "I'm leaving her a way out, a foundation, proof that someone believed in her enough to plan for her future." The final entry, dated 2 weeks before she died, was addressed directly to me. "Joanna, you were never broken. You were always whole. They just couldn't see it, because they were looking through cracked lenses. You carry my love, not my pain. Build something beautiful from these ashes. Some legacies end with us. We choose which ones continue. Choose wisely, my brave girl." I sat in that quiet bank room and wept for her, for the life she'd endured, for the grandmother who'd loved me enough to build an escape route decades in advance. I wept for my father too, for the boy who'd learned cruelty because it was the only lesson offered for the cycle that had broken him before he'd had a chance to break free. But mostly I wept with gratitude, because my grandmother had given me something more precious than money or land. She'd given me proof that I'd been loved unconditionally, that my worth had never been in question, that someone had believed in me enough to spend years planning for my freedom. I dried my eyes, gathered the journal and envelope and photographs carefully. Then I opened my laptop connected to the bank's Wi-Fi and began typing an email with a subject line that felt both inevitable and revolutionary: Project Phoenix, a sanctuary for women who were never allowed to fly. Grandmother's $50,000 would be the seed money, but this would grow into something neither of us could have imagined alone. A place where women like her, like me, like my mother, like Lila, could learn that survival wasn't the same as living, and that choosing yourself wasn't selfish, but essential. The planning began immediately. I assembled a team I'd never imagined needing: architects who specialized in trauma-informed design, therapists who understood domestic violence, recovery, nonprofit consultants who could navigate the legal complexities of charitable organizations, landscape designers who knew how to preserve natural beauty while creating functional spaces. We met in my penthouse conference room, spreading plans and proposals across every surface building, something that felt both impossibly ambitious and absolutely necessary. The vision crystallized over weeks of collaboration. Hunter Legacy Center would sit on my grandmother's land, preserving every tree she'd loved, incorporating the foundation of her old cottage into a memorial garden. We'd build small, eco-friendly cabins tucked into the hillside, each one private and self-contained, giving residents space to breathe without feeling institutionalized. A central gathering house would offer communal meals for those who wanted company and quiet reading nooks for those who needed solitude. The programming would include therapy sessions, financial literacy workshops, legal consultations with volunteer attorneys, job training, partnerships with local businesses, and simply safe space to exist without judgment or demands. "This isn't a shelter," I explained to the architects. "Shelters are critical and necessary, but they're for immediate crisis. This is for the next stage, when a woman has left or is planning to leave, when she needs to remember who she was before abuse defined her, when she needs skills and confidence and proof that she can build a different life." The design would reflect that philosophy: dignity, privacy, beauty, resources without infantilization or excessive rules. The decision about the lithium had been easier than I'd expected. We wouldn't mine it. We wouldn't sell the mineral rights. We'd preserve the land exactly as my grandmother had kept it, proof that some things mattered more than profit. The architects nodded approvingly. This choice made the project more authentic, more aligned with its stated values. Lila found me one evening pouring over therapy program proposals, trying to decide between different trauma recovery approaches. She'd been living in my guest room for 3 weeks, attending therapy twice weekly, slowly learning to exist without my father's constant direction. She sat down across from me, nervous energy radiating from her hands as they twisted together. "I want to help," she said simply. "With the center, if you'll let me." I set down the proposals, giving her my full attention. "Why?" "Because I understand what those women feel. Looking around one day and realizing the life you're living isn't actually yours. That every choice has been made by someone else, and you don't even know what you want anymore because you've never been allowed to want anything. Her voice steadied as she spoke, gaining confidence. I'm not qualified for anything important. I don't have skills yet. But I could learn. I want to earn something for the first time in my life. I considered this carefully. If you work on this project, you really work. No special treatment because you're my sister. You'd start as an unpaid intern for 6 months entry-level learning from whoever we hire as project manager. If you prove commitment and capability, we'll discuss a paid junior position. But Lila, if you're not serious, if this is just something to do while you figure out your next move, I'd rather know now. I'm serious. Her eyes met mine with more determination than I'd seen in years. I need this. Not for you, for me. I need to know I can do something real, something that matters, something that isn't just decoration in someone else's life. Then yes, we'll start next week. 6 weeks later, with architectural plans finalized and permits filed, I held a press conference. Marcus had coached me on messaging, be authentic but strategic, share enough story to contextualize the work without making it exploitative, pivot from the tabloid drama to the project's larger purpose. I stood before cameras and journalist Lila beside me for moral support and told a version of the truth that was both personal and universal. My grandmother survived 4 decades of domestic violence in an era when leaving wasn't considered an option for women. Before she died, she took steps to ensure I'd have choices she never had. Education, resources, the legal right to control my own life. The Hunter Legacy Center honors her courage by offering those same choices to other women who've been told they're trapped, powerless, less than they are. The announcement went viral for different reasons than the doc video. Donations began arriving within hours, $10, $100, $10,000 each one, accompanied by notes. For my mother who never got out. For my sister who's trying to leave. For the woman I was before he convinced me I was nothing. The local community responded too, construction workers offering discounted labor, therapists volunteering services, nearby businesses pledging support. The project became bigger than my personal story, bigger than revenge against my father, bigger than family dysfunction turned public spectacle. It became about collective healing, about women choosing women, about breaking cycles that had persisted for generations. Construction began on a clear morning in late summer. I stood on my grandmother's land watching earth movers carefully clear space for the first cabin, preserving the old oaks she'd loved, working around the rose bushes that had somehow survived years of neglect. Lila worked beside the project manager, taking notes, asking questions, learning the difference between task management and actual leadership. That evening, an email notification appeared on my phone. Sender James Collins. Subject line, a different kind of investment proposal. I opened it cautiously, remembering the last time this man had been involved in my family's business, remembering how he'd walked away from my father after witnessing the confrontation on the yacht. Collins's email was straightforward and surprisingly thoughtful. He'd watched the press conference, done his own research on domestic violence recovery programs, and wanted to discuss a matching fund investment that would double every dollar donated to the Hunter Legacy Center, up to $5 million. No operational control, no naming rights beyond a small plaque, just genuine philanthropic support from someone who'd witnessed family dysfunction firsthand and wanted to be part of something better. We scheduled a meeting for the following week. But before dealing with investors and expansion plans, I needed to focus on something more immediate: Lila's transformation from golden child to functioning adult. Her internship had started with predictable disaster. The first week she showed up late twice, forgot to return phone calls, filed grant applications incorrectly, and cried in the bathroom when Sarah Chen, our no-nonsense project manager, made her redo everything. Sarah was a 52-year-old woman who'd built her career managing nonprofit construction projects, and she had exactly 0 patience for incompetence disguised as effort. "You spent hours on these applications," Sarah told Lila flatly, reviewing her work with red pen in hand. But spending time doesn't equal doing it right. These need to be redone completely. The formatting is wrong, you've missed required sections, and the budget calculations don't add up. I watched from across the office as Lila's face crumpled, watched her start to argue, then stop herself. She was learning slowly that the world didn't owe her praise for trying. She redid the applications, stayed until 8 that night getting them right, came in early the next morning to have Sarah review them again. The second month was marginally better. Lila began arriving early, started asking questions instead of pretending she understood, developed actual organizational systems instead of relying on charm to cover mistakes. She attended the Hunter Legacy support groups not as staff but as a participant, sitting in circles with other women and hearing stories that mirrored her own in uncomfortable ways. One woman Rita described being the good daughter who did everything right but never felt loved, only useful. Lila came home that night and cried for 2 hours. "That's me," she told me, her voice raw. "I thought I was the favorite. I thought I was loved. But I was just the one performing the role he wanted. The moment I stepped out of character, he tried to destroy me too." By month 4, something had shifted. Lila approached me with a request that showed more self-awareness than I'd seen in 28 years. She wanted to apologize to the people she'd hurt when she'd sabotaged my career on father's orders. Not a casual, "I'm sorry," but detailed, accountable letters that acknowledged specific harm without making excuses. She identified 3 business contacts, people who'd been about to partner with me 8 years ago, before receiving emails from Lila claiming I was unstable and unreliable. She wrote to each of them, and I reviewed the letters before she sent them. "I lied about my sister because I was controlled by our father and too afraid to resist. My lies cost you a potentially valuable partnership and cost her an opportunity she'd earned. I don't expect forgiveness, but you deserve to know the truth." 2 responded with surprising grace. One wrote back saying she'd suspected something was off about those emails at the time, and she appreciated the honesty now. The 3rd never responded, and I watched Lila learn to sit with that rejection, to understand that accountability didn't guarantee absolution. "Not everyone has to forgive me," she said, reading the silence where a reply should have been. "My job is to acknowledge the harm I caused, not to demand that people make me feel better about it." She also created a detailed written statement about everything she'd witnessed, the forgery she'd unknowingly participated in, the recorded phone call about having me committed the coercion around her pregnancy. She had it notarized and filed with my lawyer, a formal record that said, "I am willing to testify. I will not protect him anymore." 6 months into her internship, Lila and I had dinner together at a quiet restaurant, not as boss and employee, but as sisters attempting something we'd never really had before, an honest relationship. She asked the question I'd been waiting for. "Do you think you'll ever trust me?" I considered this carefully, knowing she deserved truth more than comfort. "I'm starting to. Trust isn't rebuilt in a single moment or a single apology. It's rebuilt in 1,000 small moments of consistency. Of you showing up when it's hard. Of you doing the right thing even when no one's watching. Of you becoming someone whose word actually means something." She nodded, absorbing this without defensiveness. "I've been accepted to community college, part-time business administration classes. I want to understand how you built your company, how to be capable instead of just decorative." "That's good," I said, meaning it. "Education for yourself, not to please anyone else." We talked about father. He'd recovered physically, sold his house to pay debts, moved to a small condo, and largely disappeared from public life. The tabloid narrative had collapsed under the weight of evidence, and he'd stopped trying to control the story. Lila admitted she felt sorry for him sometimes but didn't want contact. "I can have compassion from a distance," she said. "I'm learning the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation. I can acknowledge his humanity without letting him back into my life." "That's actually very healthy," I told her. "It took me years to understand that distinction." The following week, Sarah pulled me aside after our staff meeting. Her expression was carefully neutral, but I knew her well enough to see the approval underneath. "I'd like to offer your sister a paid position, junior coordinator for the retreat programming. It's entry level, but it's real work with real responsibility." Has she earned it? I asked, needing to hear it from someone who had no reason to be generous. Yes, not because she's your sister, but because she's actually become competent. She shows up, she learns from mistakes, she doesn't expect special treatment, and she gives a damn about the work. Sarah paused. She's not perfect, but she's genuine. That matters. I smiled, feeling something tight in my chest finally loosen. Then offer it to her yourself. She deserves to hear it from you, not from me. I watched through the office window as Sarah called Lila into her office, as my sister's expression shifted from nervous to stunned to tearfully grateful. This was the first thing Lila had ever earned on her own merit, the first recognition that wasn't tied to being father's favorite or performing a role someone else had written. She was 28 years old and finally learning what it felt like to be valued for who she actually was. While Lila was finding her footing through work, my mother was navigating her own transformation, one that looked different but was no less profound. Her divorce finalized 8 months after the Yacht confrontation processed through attorneys and mediation sessions, where my father had tried repeatedly to use guilt and financial threats to maintain control. The settlement was modest, but fair enough for her to live on carefully a division of assets that left her with independence, if not luxury. For the first time in 40 years, Margaret Hunter had her own bank account with only her name on it. Her own credit card that she could use without permission or explanation. A small one-bedroom apartment she'd chosen herself, furnished with second-hand pieces and plants she was learning to keep alive. The first month she called me almost daily, crying about how quiet it was, how she didn't know what to do with herself, how terrifying it felt to make even simple decisions without checking if they were correct. I'm 62 years old, and I don't know how to be alone, she told me one evening, her voice breaking. I went to the grocery store today and stood in the cereal aisle for 20 minutes because I've never bought cereal just for myself. I don't even know what kind I like. I helped her through those early weeks, teaching her the basics I'd learned at 18, how to budget, how to pay bills online, how to make decisions by trusting her own judgment instead of seeking external validation. She took a part-time job at a local bookstore, not for the money though, that helped, but for structure, for human connection, for the simple dignity of being useful without being used. Her boss, Emily, was 35 and reminded me of myself, competent, kind, independent. My mother began learning from younger women, unlearning the helplessness that had been carefully cultivated over decades. She learned to use technology to navigate the world alone, to exist as a person rather than an appendage of someone else's life. When the Hunter Legacy Center opened its doors, my mother asked if she could volunteer. I was hesitant. Would it be too triggering? Would she be able to handle other women's stories when her own were still so raw? But she insisted, and I realized I was still treating her like she needed protection when what she needed was purpose. She started an intake, greeting women as they arrived, helping them settle into their cabins, explaining the programs available. I watched her one afternoon with Diane, a 59-year-old woman, freshly divorced after 35 years of marriage, still wearing her wedding ring out of habit. I don't know who I am anymore, Diane said, her voice hollow. I was someone's wife for so long I forgot to be anything else. My mother sat down beside her, took her hand gently. I know exactly how you feel. I left my marriage at 62. For 40 years I was defined by someone else's needs, someone else's decisions, someone else's version of who I should be. It's terrifying to start over this late, but it's also... She paused, finding the word liberating. To discover you still exist underneath all those layers of other people's expectations. She began leading support groups for women, over 50 women navigating late-life divorce or family estrangement, women learning to build identities separate from the relationships that had defined them. My mother was honest in those groups in ways she'd never been before, honest about enabling abuse, about choosing comfort over courage, about the years she'd spent betraying her own conscience to keep peace. I can't undo the past, she told her groups. I can't give my daughters back their childhoods. But I can stop doing it. I can stop choosing silence, and that's where I'm starting. 6 months into her new life, she invited me to her apartment for dinner. It was simple food, roasted chicken vegetables, bread she'd baked herself, but it was made with care and served without apology. The first meal she'd cooked specifically for me, for us, without my father's presence or preferences dominating everything. "I need to say something," she told me as we sat across her small table. "I can't give you back your childhood. I can't erase the times I should have protected you and chose him instead. But I promise you I will never ask you to sacrifice yourself for family peace again. I will never tell you to be smaller so someone else can feel bigger. I'm done with that version of myself." I felt tears spilling over despite my attempts to stay composed. That's all I ever wanted. Just for someone to see it was wrong, to name it, to choose me for once. "I'm choosing you now," she said firmly. "I know it's late. I know it doesn't fix anything, but I'm choosing you now." We established new boundaries after that dinner, weekly phone calls, monthly visits, honest communication even when it was uncomfortable. We were building an adult relationship based on who we both were now, not trying to resurrect or repair what we'd been before. It wasn't perfect, and some wounds would never fully heal, but it was real, and it was ours. As I was leaving that evening, she walked me to the door and mentioned something almost casually, as if it weren't significant. "Your father called me yesterday. Asked if I'd testify on his behalf if anyone ever pursues additional charges, if the business about the forged documents becomes criminal after all." I stopped my hand on the doorknob. "What did you tell him?" "I told him no. That I wouldn't lie for him anymore, wouldn't help him escape consequences for his choices. He didn't take it well. Started threatening me, said I'd regret abandoning family, that I'd end up alone and desperate." She paused, her expression uncertain. "Joanna," his voice, there was something in it that scared me. Not the usual anger, something more desperate. "I think he might try something. I don't know what, but something." I felt cold certainty settle in my stomach. My father had been quiet for months, accepting defeat too easily for someone who'd spent decades needing control. Of course it wasn't over. Of course there was one more move, one more manipulation, one final attempt to reclaim power. "If he contacts you again, don't engage," I told her. "Document it. Tell me immediately, but don't respond. And Mom, thank you for telling me." She hugged me, brief, awkward but genuine, and I left feeling the weight of unfinished business pressing against my chest. Collins's formal meeting request came through proper channels, his assistant contacting Marcus, scheduling through official calendars, requesting conference room time with space for his legal team. Everything transparent and professional, nothing hidden or manipulative. We met in my office on a Tuesday morning, sunlight streaming through the windows, contracts and proposals laid out on the table between us. He'd aged slightly since the yacht confrontation, a few more gray hairs at his temples, but his eyes held something different now. Not the calculating assessment of a man evaluating business opportunities, but genuine engagement with purpose beyond profit. His legal team consisted of 2 attorneys who specialized in nonprofit partnerships and philanthropic structures, not the aggressive corporate types who usually accompanied high-stakes negotiations. "Ms. Hunter, I've been following the Hunter Legacy Center's development." He began, his tone direct, but respectful. "I need to acknowledge that my initial involvement with your family was problematic. Your father presented what seemed like a legitimate investment opportunity, and I didn't ask enough questions. I should have done more due diligence, should have questioned why he was so eager to sell valuable land quickly. I witnessed something on that yacht that made me reconsider not just that deal, but how I approach business generally." I appreciated the honesty, but remained cautious. "What exactly are you proposing?" "A matching fund investment structure. For every dollar donated to the Hunter Legacy Center by the public Collins Investments, we'll match it up to $5 million total. No operational control, no board seats, no influence over programming or mission. Just financial support for work I believe matters." It was generous. Perhaps too generous, which made me suspicious. "Why? What's your interest in this particular project?" He was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice held personal weight. My mother left an abusive marriage when I was 12 years old. It was 1987. She had no college degree, no work history, 3 children and a husband who'd convinced her she was incapable of surviving alone. She took us to a women's shelter that gave her 6 weeks of safety while she figured out next steps. That shelter saved our lives. Without it, she would have gone back to him, and I don't know if we would have survived his escalating violence. He pulled out a folder, slid it across the table. This is information about my philanthropic history. Donations to domestic violence organizations, funding for women's emergency services, board positions with advocacy groups. This isn't performative, it's personal. When I saw what you're building, something beyond emergency shelter, something focused on rebuilding rather than just surviving, I wanted to be part of it. I spent 3 days having my team vet Colin's investments. We pulled annual reports, investigated past philanthropic partnerships, interviewed directors of organizations he'd funded, searched for any hint of strings attached or mission drift imposed by his involvement. Everything came back clean. His donations had genuinely supported organizations without attempting to control them. His interest seemed authentic rather than strategic. We scheduled a second meeting where I laid out my terms with absolute clarity. Your name can be on the building, the Collins Foundation Retreat House, or something similar. But you have zero operational control. No input on who we serve, how we serve them, what therapeutic approaches we use, nothing. Full financial transparency on our end, with annual audits and public reporting of how every donated dollar is spent. And this clause, I pointed to specific language my lawyers had drafted, states that if you ever attempt to influence our mission operations or programming, the partnership immediately dissolves and all previously donated funds become unrestricted gifts with no naming rights. Collins read through every page carefully, his attorneys making notes, asking clarifying questions. Then he looked up and smiled. I wouldn't want it any other way. When you're giving money to do good work, you trust the people doing the work. You don't try to control them. We signed the agreement 2 weeks later at a community event, celebrating the foundation laying for the first residential cabin. Local press attended, donors who'd contributed $10 and $10,000 alike, volunteers who'd committed time and skills, and women who'd registered to be among the first residents once we opened. The crowd was diverse in age, background, and reason for being there, but unified in supporting something that felt bigger than any individual story. I spoke first, keeping my remarks focused on my grandmother's legacy and the vision she'd protected for me. She refused to let abuse be the end of her story. She spent years planning to ensure I'd have choices she never had. This center honors her courage by offering those same choices to every woman who needs them. Collins spoke next, and his words surprised me with their humility. I initially came to this family to make money off land. I saw an investment opportunity, a quick profit, a smart business move. What I witnessed instead was a daughter protecting her grandmother's legacy at enormous personal cost. I learned that some things are worth more than profit, and some investments pay dividends that can't be measured in dollars. I'm honored to support this work. The contrast with my father's schemes couldn't have been clearer. Transparent partnership versus hidden manipulation, values, alignment versus exploitation, mutual respect versus control. This was what authentic collaboration looked like, built on honesty and shared purpose, rather than leverage and secrets. As the ceremony concluded, Marcus appeared at my elbow, his voice low and urgent. Don't react obviously, but your father is here. Across the street in that dark sedan. He's been watching for about 20 minutes. My stomach tightened. I glanced carefully in the direction Marcus indicated and saw the familiar silhouette behind the wheel. Just watching. Not approaching, not engaging. Just observing with an intensity that felt like a threat even at this distance. Call security, I said quietly. Make sure he stays at that distance. And document that he's here. I want it on record. My father's presence at the ceremony wasn't an isolated incident. Over the following weeks, Marcus compiled reports of him appearing at other events, sitting in his car outside my office building, parked down the street from the construction site, once even at the bookstore where my mother worked, though he didn't enter. He was watching, cataloging, waiting for something, though I couldn't determine what. We documented everything, consulted with attorneys about restraining orders, but he was careful to stay just within legal boundaries. Watching wasn't threatening. Watching was just unsettling. Meanwhile, the doc video had taken on a life far beyond my control or intention. 10 million views had become 15 million, then 20. Domestic violence awareness organizations used it in training materials showing textbook examples of public humiliation as abuse tactic. Psychology experts appeared on news segments analyzing the family dynamics: the scapegoat daughter, the golden child, the enabling mother, the narcissistic patriarch. My father's face became recognizable in ways he'd never intended, associated not with success or respect, but with cruelty captured on camera. Marcus tracked the social fallout with almost anthropological fascination. "Your father went to his usual coffee shop yesterday," he reported. 3 regular customers saw him and moved to different tables. The barista served him but didn't make small talk like she usually does with regulars. He left after 10 minutes instead of his usual hour. The local business association where father had held a board seat for 15 years requested his resignation, not because of anything illegal, but because members were uncomfortable and thought a change in leadership would be beneficial. His few remaining business contacts stopped returning calls. Invitations to networking events dried up, and the country club where he'd played golf for decades suddenly had no available tea times whenever he called. He was experiencing social death, the kind of invisible exile where you're technically allowed to exist, but no one wants to acknowledge your presence. It was exactly what he'd inflicted on me my entire childhood, except he'd built his identity on being respected, admired, central to his community. Losing that was devastating in ways that loss of money never could be. His financial situation collapsed with brutal efficiency. The proceeds from selling the family home went almost entirely to repaying the fraudulent loan the bank had been willing to settle rather than pursue criminal charges, but they wanted their money. Legal fees consumed most of what remained. He'd moved to a modest 2-bedroom apartment in a less prestigious part of town, the kind of generic complex where neighbors didn't know each other's names, and no one cared about your professional history. I learned these details not from following him, but from my mother, who heard things through the residual gossip networks of a town where everyone knew everyone. "People feel sorry for him," she told me. "But it's that pity that's worse than contempt. They see him as someone who had everything and destroyed it himself." 6 months after our hospital confrontation, I decided I needed one final conversation. Not for him, but for me to close a chapter definitively, to say what needed saying, to walk away, knowing I'd done everything I could to be fair, despite having every right to be vindictive. I showed up at his apartment unannounced on a Tuesday afternoon. The building smelled like old carpet, and someone's cooking the hallways painted in generic beige, nothing like the waterfront mansion where I'd grown up. He answered the door in sweatpants and a coffee-stained t-shirt, looking older than his 66 years. The vitality that had always defined him dimmed to something closer to mere existence. "Joanna." He seemed unsure whether to be surprised or defensive. "What are you doing here?" "I came to tell you something." I stayed in the doorway, not accepting his gesture to come inside. "I've set up a small trust that will cover your basic medical expenses and living costs. Nothing extravagant, but enough for dignity. It's managed by a third-party administrator, so you'll never have to contact me for it." "I don't want your charity." "It's not charity," I interrupted. "It's the difference between who you are and who I choose to be. You would let someone suffer unnecessarily out of pride or spite. I won't. But this doesn't mean we have a relationship. This doesn't mean I forgive you. This means I'm ensuring you won't be destitute, and then I'm walking away." He tried the old tactics: guilt about family obligations, suggestions that I was being cruel, implications that a good daughter wouldn't abandon her father in his declining years. I let him talk until he ran out of steam. Then I said what I'd come to say. You had 40 years to be different. 40 years to choose kindness over control, to see your daughters as people rather than reflections of your ego, to build something based on love instead of fear. You chose cruelty every time. I spent decades thinking something was wrong with me, that I was the problem. I'm done carrying that. Your loneliness, your isolation, your regret, those are yours to carry. I won't do it for you anymore. I said I'm sorry, he said, and his voice actually broke. I know. But sorry doesn't undo 40 years. Sorry is a start, not an ending, and it doesn't obligate me to anything. I turned to leave, then paused. This is the last time I'll come here. Don't try to contact me. Don't show up at my events. Don't use other people to send messages. We're done. I walked away without looking back, down the generic hallway, past the smell of cooking and old carpet, out into the autumn afternoon. The air was crisp leaves turning gold and red, the kind of weather my grandmother used to love. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. The first 3 residents are arriving tomorrow. Everything's ready. Are you? I smiled, genuine and unreserved. Yes. Let's begin. The morning the Hunter Legacy Center officially opened, I stood on my grandmother's land and felt her presence in ways I hadn't since her death. The property had been transformed, but not violated. Small, eco-friendly cabins nestled among the oak trees. She'd loved their design, deliberately unobtrusive, painted in earth tones that blended with the natural landscape. Walking paths wound through the gardens where volunteers had planted native flowers and herbs, creating spaces for quiet reflection or gentle movement. And at the heart of everything sat the main gathering house, built on the foundation of her old cottage, incorporating stones from her original fireplace and beams salvaged from the porch where we'd sat together watching sunsets. Staff had been arriving since dawn, making final preparations. Maria, now our hospitality manager, moved through the main house with the same quiet competence she'd brought to my family's home, but here her care was appreciated rather than taken for granted. Dr. Ellis and Dr. Patel. Our 2 therapists reviewed their schedules and treatment approaches. Carmen, our financial counselor, organized materials for the workshop she'd lead on budgeting, credit repair, and financial independence. And volunteers, including my mother, prepared welcome packets and familiarized themselves with the property. Lila appeared beside me, clipboard in hand, wearing professional clothes she'd bought with her first paycheck. The first residents will arrive within the hour. Helen is driving herself. Patricia's niece is dropping her off, and Yolanda is taking a cab from the bus station. Their cabins are ready, welcome packets are on their beds, and we've scheduled individual orientation meetings before tonight's optional group dinner. You've done good work, I told her, meaning it. She smiled, tentative but genuine. I'm terrified I'll forget something important. You probably will. Everyone does on opening day, but we'll handle it. I squeezed her shoulder. You're ready for this? Helen arrived first, driving a beat-up sedan that looked like it had carried her through numerous crises. She was 47, thin, in that way that suggested stress rather than intentional weight loss, wearing jeans and a sweater that had seen better days. She stood in the parking area for a long moment, just staring at the property, before Maria approached her with gentle warmth. Welcome. You must be Helen. I'm Maria, the hospitality manager. Can I help you with your bags? Patricia came next, dropped off by a young woman who hugged her quickly and drove away with obvious relief at having fulfilled her obligation. Patricia was 61, dressed carefully in clothes that spoke of someone who'd once had means, but was now making do, carrying herself with the careful dignity of someone determined not to show how broken she felt inside. Yolanda, 35, arrived in a taxi, paying with carefully counted bills, looking around the property with something between hope and disbelief. She was the youngest of our first residents, but her eyes held the exhaustion of someone much older. We gathered them in the main house, offered tea and coffee, and the cookies Maria had baked that morning explained how the center worked, the optional nature of all programming, the respect for privacy, the understanding that healing wasn't linear, and everyone moved at their own pace. We gave them time to settle into their cabins, to breathe, to begin believing that this safe space was real and available to them. The next morning, Dr. Ellis facilitated our first group session, optional as everything would be, but all three women chose to attend. They sat in comfortable chairs arranged in a circle in the gathering house's sunlit common room, nervous and uncertain, clutching coffee mugs like lifelines. "This is a space for story sharing," Dr. Ellis explained, her voice calm and professional but warm. "You can share as much or as little as feels right. You can listen without speaking. There's no pressure, no judgment, just witnessing and support." Helen spoke first, her voice soft but steady, telling a story I'd heard variations of dozens of times during planning, but that still hit with fresh impact. She'd married at 23 to a man who'd seemed charming and protective, who'd gradually isolated her from friends and family, controlled every dollar, convinced her she was incapable of functioning without him. When she'd finally left after 20 years, after the violence had escalated to a point where she feared for her life, she'd had $40 and a black eye. She'd been sleeping in her car for 3 weeks before finding our program. "I kept telling myself I just needed to be better," she said, tears sliding down her face. "More patient, more understanding, less demanding. I thought if I could just figure out how to be the wife he needed, he'd become the husband I remembered from the beginning." Patricia shared next her story, different in specifics but painfully similar in structure. A devoted mother who'd tried for 35 years to keep peace between her children and their verbally abusive father. When she'd finally divorced him, exhausted and broken, her adult children had blamed her for destroying the family. They'd sided with their father, stopped speaking to her, excluded her from grandchildren's lives. At 61, she found herself completely alone, questioning whether she'd made a terrible mistake by leaving, wondering if suffering in silence would have been better than this isolation. Yolanda, the youngest, described a different kind of abuse. Her family had used her as a financial resource, taking out credit cards in her name, convincing her to co-sign loans they never repaid, guilt-tripping her into funding their expenses, while she worked multiple jobs and lived in poverty. When she'd finally said no, they'd turned on her, calling her selfish and cruel, spreading lies about her in their community, making her the villain of a story where she was actually the victim. Dr. Ellis looked at me, sitting slightly apart from the circle but present in the room. "Joanna, would you like to share your story?" "You don't have to, but sometimes it helps residents to hear from the person who created this space to understand why it exists." I hadn't planned to speak, had thought my role was to facilitate rather than participate. But looking at these three women, seeing their pain and courage and tentative hope, I knew they needed to understand they weren't alone, even in the specifics of family betrayal. So I told them about being the scapegoat child, about leaving at 18 with $200 and a vow to never let them control me again, about building a company my family didn't know existed, about the yacht reveal that should have been triumph but felt hollow because I'd still wanted their recognition, about my grandmother's secret will and my father's forgery, and the choice I'd faced: revenge or healing, destruction or creation. I could have pressed criminal charges, I told them. I had evidence of multiple felonies. I could have put him in prison, destroyed him publicly, taken everything. And part of me wanted that. The angry 18-year-old inside me wanted him to suffer the way he'd made me suffer. I paused, finding the words. But I realized revenge wouldn't heal me. It would just make him the center of my story forever. So I chose this instead. I chose to take the pain he caused and transform it into something that might prevent other women from carrying the same wounds. I chose to honor my grandmother's legacy by creating what she would have wanted: a place where women could learn they're worthy without having to earn it. The room was silent except for quiet crying. Patricia reached for Helen's hand. Yolanda wiped her eyes with shaking fingers. And I saw it, beginning the formation of community through shared understanding, the realization that their stories mattered, that their pain was valid, that survival alone wasn't enough when healing was possible. That evening, as the sun set over the property, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose that my grandmother would have loved, I walked the perimeter path, checking on things that didn't need checking, just wanting to be present in this moment. Patricia found me near the memorial garden where we'd planted a rose bush and installed a small plaque with my grandmother's name. "Thank you," she said simply. For this place, for seeing us. Then after a pause, but I have a question. I heard someone mention that this land is sitting on some kind of valuable mineral deposit, that you could have made millions from it. What made you decide not to mine it, not to sell it? I looked at her, at this woman learning to rebuild her life at 61, and I thought about my grandmother's note about legacies and choices and the difference between price and value. Let me tell you about a choice my grandmother made, I said, and gestured for her to sit beside me on the memorial garden bench. Patricia and I sat on the memorial garden bench as the sun sank lower, and I told her what I'd discovered about the land beneath our feet, about the geological survey that had revealed a lithium deposit worth potentially $50 to $80 million if mining rights were developed, perhaps double that, with the electric vehicle boom driving demand for battery materials. About my father's desperate schemes suddenly making terrible sense. He'd known about the wealth buried here, had tried every manipulation to access it before anyone else discovered what he'd found. That money could have funded multiple centers, I told her honestly. Could have helped thousands of women instead of the 100 or so we'll serve each year here. I could have mined it responsibly, used the profits for good, justified it as the practical choice, the one that would do the most good for the most people. By now, Helen and Yolanda had joined us, drawn by the conversation, and a few staff members had drifted over as well. I found myself speaking to all of them, explaining a choice that would define not just this property, but what the Hunter Legacy Center would stand for. But this land wasn't just real estate to my grandmother. It was where she found peace when her home life was violent and unpredictable. It was where she could breathe without someone controlling her breath. When the mining company contacted her 5 years ago, she wrote in her notes, "They don't want the property, they want to hollow it out and leave a scar. My son will sell it to them in a heartbeat because he sees only dollar signs where I see 50 years of sanctuary. Some legacies cannot be measured in profit margins." I gestured to the oak trees surrounding us, the rose garden, the quiet paths winding through native plants. If I mined this land, I'd be choosing exactly what my father would have chosen money over, meaning profit over peace, the measurable over the essential. I'd be proving that at the end of the day I was just like him, just better at hiding it. "So, what will you do?" Helen asked quietly. "I've placed the land in a permanent conservation trust. It's legally protected now from any future mining or industrial development, regardless of who owns it or what pressures they face. The Hunter Legacy Center will operate on donations, grants, and support from my business ventures. We'll help fewer women, but we'll help them deeply and well. We'll preserve this place exactly as my grandmother kept it, proof that some things matter more than their monetary value." The women were quiet, processing this. Then Patricia spoke, her voice thick with emotion. "You chose us over millions of dollars. I chose what my grandmother taught me, that healing doesn't happen in industrial parks or urban developments. It happens in places where you can remember you're part of something larger than human cruelty, where you can sit under trees that have witnessed 100 years and realize your pain, while real, is not permanent." The decision went public the following week. Marcus helped me craft a statement that framed it clearly. The Hunter Legacy Center would remain small-scale and place-based, choosing depth over breadth, quality over quantity, preservation over exploitation. The response surprised me. Donations actually increased, with notes saying things like, "Thank you for choosing values over profits," and "This is what integrity looks like." Major newspapers ran opinion pieces about business ethics and legacy building. Women's organizations from across the country contacted us, asking for our operational blueprint, wanting to create similar sanctuaries in their regions. I began sharing everything freely: our programming structure, our financial model, our architectural plans, our staffing philosophy. If other communities wanted to build their own versions of this work, I'd help them rather than franchising or controlling it. The movement grew beyond my single center, beyond my personal story, becoming something genuinely collective. The residents watched all of this with something like wonder. "You could have kept it proprietary," Yolanda observed. "Made money from licensing the model." "That would defeat the purpose," I said. "This isn't about building an empire. It's about building a movement. If 50 other centers exist 5 years from now, each one adapted to their local communities and needs, each one preserving land that might otherwise be exploited, that's success. My grandmother didn't protect this land, so I could monopolize the idea of sanctuary. She protected it so I'd learn the difference between ownership and stewardship. That evening, as the women gathered for dinner in the main house, sharing food and beginning to share their lives, my phone rang. Captain Daniel Pierce calling from the yacht that had witnessed the beginning of this entire transformation. "Ms. Hunter, I hope I'm not overstepping," he began. "But I wanted to make an offer, the Meridian Star I'd like to offer her for your center's first women's retreat. No charter fee, just operational costs. After what I witnessed that day at the dock, the way your family treated you and the way you responded with such grace under pressure, I've been thinking about how vessels like ours could serve a higher purpose." I was quite moved by the unexpected offer, by the realization that the yacht symbol of my father's humiliation and my surprising power might become something else entirely, a space for healing that literally moved women away from their pain into new possibilities. "Captain Pierce, I accept. Thank you." "No, Ms. Hunter. Thank you for showing us what real strength looks like." 3 months after the Hunter Legacy Center opened its doors, the Meridian Star prepared for a different kind of voyage. The same yacht where my father had tried to humiliate me, where I'd revealed the truth about ownership and power, would now carry 20 women on a 3-day retreat designed for healing rather than display. The irony wasn't lost on me, but it felt right, taking a symbol of my pain and transforming it into a tool for collective recovery. Lila had coordinated every logistical detail with the precision she'd developed over months of genuine work. Cabin assignments that respected privacy while encouraging connection, workshop schedules that balanced structure with flexibility, meal plans that accommodated various dietary needs and preferences. She moved through the preparations with quiet confidence, no longer the golden child performing for approval, but a professional who understood the weight of responsibility. My mother would serve as an elder mentor, sharing her story of leaving at 62, offering living proof that second chapters were possible at any age. Maria had planned the hospitality details with her characteristic warmth, ensuring every woman would feel welcomed rather than processed. And Captain Pierce had briefed his crew on the mission's significance, emphasizing that this wasn't a luxury cruise, but a sacred journey for women reclaiming their lives. The participants arrived throughout the morning, each one carrying a small bag and a lifetime of pain barely contained. Most were between 45 and 70 women who'd spent decades in marriages or family systems that had diminished them so gradually they hadn't noticed until they'd nearly disappeared. Among them was Sarah, 58 years old, whose story could have been written by someone who knew mine intimately. Her husband had treated her with contempt disguised as concern. Her adult children had sided with their father when she'd finally left, and she felt worthless after 35 years of being told she was too emotional, too sensitive, too demanding. I found her standing on the dock, staring at the yacht like it was a ship to somewhere she couldn't imagine reaching. "Sarah." I approached gently. "I'm Joanna. Welcome." "I don't know why I came," she said, her voice breaking. "I'm 58. It's too late to start over, too late to be anything other than someone's discarded wife." I gestured toward the yacht where my mother was greeting other women. "See that woman? That's my mother, Margaret. She left her marriage at 62 after 40 years. She's learning to live alone, to make decisions without permission, to exist as herself rather than someone's wife. And she'll tell you the same thing I'm about to say. It's never too late for a second chapter. It's never too late to remember who you were before they convinced you to be smaller." Sarah looked at Margaret, then back at me, something like hope flickering in her exhausted eyes. "You really believe that?" "I know it. Because I watched my mother transform at 62, watched my sister rebuild herself at 28, watched myself learn at 37 that my father's rejection wasn't a verdict on my worth, but a reflection of his limitations." By early afternoon, all 20 women were aboard. I stood on deck watching them explore the spaces that had once witnessed my humiliation, now repurposed for their healing. Some moved tentatively, as if afraid to take up space. Others wept quietly, overwhelmed by being cared for. A few smiled with cautious hope, perhaps beginning to believe that this sanctuary was real. Captain Pierce approached his weathered face, gentle with understanding. "Madam Owner, we're ready to depart." Ready to sail. I looked around at my mother, helping a woman find her cabin at Lila, checking the workshop schedule with genuine investment at Maria distributing welcome packets, with warm efficiency at 20 women beginning to breathe differently in a space designed for their flourishing rather than their diminishment. The weight I'd carried for 37 years, the certainty that I was somehow fundamentally unworthy, had finally lifted. Not because my father had apologized or changed, but because I'd chosen transformation over destruction, healing over revenge, collective liberation over individual triumph. "Yes," I said to Captain Pierce. "Let's begin." As the Meridian Star pulled away from the dock, gliding into open water with 20 women who'd been told they couldn't, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. My father had taught me I wasn't enough, not smart enough, not pretty enough, not worth the space I occupied. My grandmother had taught me I was everything whole, worthy, deserving of love without earning it. And now I was teaching others the same truth, creating spaces where women could remember they'd never been broken, just convinced they were. This yacht wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to every woman who'd been dismissed, diminished, or discarded. It belonged to every daughter who'd been compared unfavorably to a golden child. It belonged to every wife who'd spent decades shrinking herself to fit someone else's requirements. And as we sailed into the sunset, my grandmother would have loved I finally understood that the best revenge wasn't destruction, it was transformation. Not just mine. Ours. If this story moved you, if you've ever felt invisible in your own family or dismissed by people who should have loved you, you're not alone. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever been the scapegoat in your family? Have you found the courage to walk away and build your own life? Your story matters, and this community is here to listen. If you want more stories about women who refused to stay broken, who turned their pain into power and their trauma into triumph, subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. Every week we share real stories of resilience, revenge done right, and women who proved that the best answer to cruelty is building something beautiful. Don't let the algorithm hide these stories from you. Subscribe now and let's build a community where every woman's voice is heard and valued. What would you do if you were Joanna? Tell us in the comments. Tell us in the